And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's fantastic to have everyone here. We have some wild technical snafus in the open, but we're joined by Gigi Young. Gigi, can you hear me? Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
Gigi. Well, she's down there. She will join us eventually. And there she is. Gigi. Can you hear me?
Oh. My computer's like spinning now.
You're good. You're good. You're good. I can hear you now.
They don't want me to do this.
You're good. You're good.
I don't know what's happening. It's like frozen.
It's okay. I can hear you. I can hear you. You're good.
I can't. It's like I can't even do anything. No,
okay.
I don't have a lot of windows open.
I can hear you. I can hear you. Gigi, if you can hear me, I can hear you. You're good. You're good. There you go.
No, I'm not responding.
Yes. You see that? And you're good. So we get Gigi the big thumbs up. We're going to get Gigi on. It's going to be good. No worries about it. Now, we've had some very interesting technical issues, and considering the material that we're working on, I'm not a bit surprised because it's been kind of spookland on the tech side. But in any case, I am joined as usual by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And tonight we're going to do something very special. We are here in this episode looking at Hemingway's deep interaction with the JFK assassination. And I have Gigi back. Gigi, yes.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. Hi. We're here. We're doing it.
The one where it froze on you before, it looked like an album cover. You were like,
no. I have no idea what's going on. Like my computer is like plugged into the modem, and I've done this so many times. I really don't know. I was just saying,
given the material, given the fast breaking nature of this report, I'm not too surprised.
Yeah. But you can hear me okay? You can see me okay?
Yes, you're fine. You're coming through like gold. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to jump right in. And Gigi, what I'm going to do, we have these very interesting quotes we were going to start with.
Yeah.
Have those handy. So I'm going to have you start with your first one, and then I'll come in with mine, and then you come in with yours.
Okay. So, as indicated, the records of the manners of construction of the same are in 3 places in the earth. As it stands today, in the sunken portions of Atlantis or Presidia, where the portion of temples may have been discovered under the slime of ages of seawater near what is known as Bimini off the coast of Florida, and in the temple records that were in Egypt, where the entity later acted in cooperation with the others in preserving the records that came from the land where these had been kept. Also the records that were carried to what is now Yucatan in America, where these stones that they know so little about are now, during the last few months, being uncovered.
Right. Fascinating. That is Edgar Cayce's reading, giving us an idea about these Atlantean firestones or the two-eye crystal. And then I'm going to quote here now from Plato in his original description of Atlantis. Then we'll go back to Gigi. Quote, "This power came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean. For in those days the Atlantic was navigable, and there was an island situated in front of the straits, which are by you called the Pillars of Heracles. The island was larger than Libya and Asia put together, and was the way to other islands, and from these you might pass to the whole of the opposite continent, which surrounded the true ocean. For this sea, which is within the Straits of Heracles, is only a harbor, having a narrow entrance, but that other is a real sea, and the surrounding land may be most truly called a boundless continent." This is the reference to Atlantis that Plato first made, and it was essentially a relative of his giving him this indication of a story he had heard from Solon, who was an Egyptian priest, who told him, "You Greeks are great now, this is about 500 BC, but 9,000 years ago, you guys were amazing because you had to fight off this incredible horde of egress from these egressing Atlanteans. Quite fascinating. Gigi, the next quote.
All right, so this is Cayce. The position as the continent Atlantis occupied is that as between the Gulf of Mexico on the one hand and the Mediterranean upon the other. Evidences of this lost civilization are to be found in the Pyrenees and Morocco on one hand, British Honduras, Yucatan, and America on the other. There are some protruding portions within this that must have at one time or another been a portion of this great continent. The British West Indies or Bahamas, and a portion of the same that may have been in the present. If the geological survey would be made in some of these, especially or notably in Bimini and in the Gulf Stream through this vicinity, these may be even yet determined. And that was from 364.3 of one of his things.
Excellent. Reading number and everything. Nicely done. And so everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist X series. Last week, we introduced some special evidence which showed there was a connection, a deep, deep connection relating to the deep state, the JFK assassination, and the search for Atlantis that Hemingway had engaged on. And we're going to show further proof tonight that Hemingway and his mother and elements in his family, like his brother Les, were associated with Edgar Cayce. And Edgar Cayce was giving readings at the time about Atlantis rising in its first major stop off the coast of Bimini, which he predicted in '68 and did come true. Now, a series of researchers like Dr. David Zink, Andrew Collins, Graham Hancock have looked into the ruins around this area, and we have a lot of information from them about this tonight. One of the key things about this and the Hemingways is that right now there's an exhibit going on at the JFK Library and Museum, which I visited and spent some time with. The things that they were showing there, and it is a joint Kennedy and Hemingway exhibit. What we discovered and what we laid out in the last episode is that there was a capsule and a vault at Hemingway's residence in Cuba, and that it was the scene of a national security memo that I have uncovered here, which originally came out as a result of the Assassination Record Review Board, but nobody has put together up to now the Finca Vigía, this kind of villa that Hemingway was in relating to this vault and the national security action to get it out. What we showed last week were these stories about Mary Hemingway getting help directly from JFK and his administration and convincing Cuba to let go of that vault and to smuggle that material back to the United States on a shrimp boat from Cuba. All those things are on record, and we have brought them forward. The revelations that we're making in these episodes dealing with Hemingway, Cuba, Cayce, and the JFK assassination do change history in this sense, that everything that we're going to talk about tonight is documented and either comes from a Cayce reading or a document relating to the federal government, like Ed Lansdale's material. We're also going to present the fact that Gigi Young, as you know, when we do in the X series, which we spend a lot of time going after the X Steganography. And the X Steganography basically works like this. We get the X and how they use it as a code in these government programs. So we've seen it all through these different government agencies and how they move secret projects. So when we were looking at the secret X planes, for example, eventually what I noticed after looking at about 160 of these different cases, the whole thing goes black. And then it reemerges with this X name, very interestingly. But further on down the road, just in case, I know most of you guys understand this, but for those of you who are new, the X Steganography, in fact, I found out goes much, much deeper into history and goes all the way back to the Book of the Dead and the Atlantis debacle and all that destruction. And one of the codes that they maintained through the mystery school tradition is this X. And this has led us in this whole search to these ruins of Atlantis that are rising, according to the Cayce readings. Now, one of the interesting aspects that we use, which isn't employed traditionally, is this kind of psychic archaeology. and this is the psychic investigation of Gigi Young, whose deep intuitive work is well known. And, everyone knows that Gigi is a fantastic ally and friend to the X series. There's no better friend to the work that we're doing here. So it's great to have you here, Gigi.
Thank you for having me.
What we're going to do is, before we dive off the board into the deep waters of Hemingway and Atlantis and JFK, I want you to kind of set the scene for why it's so important and why it would be such a major secret if Atlantis were rising and these national security state patrons were moving to keep that secrecy. Why would they be so hell-bent on keeping the secrecy of Atlantis rising?
Well, Atlantis is the biggest secret. It is the biggest secret. And that's because it's a layered secret. So if Atlantis were to rise, even in memory, even if people just started to remember and read a Cayce reading or whatever, and just to kind of remember, it would change their consciousness, because Atlantis is sort of in another time, and it reminds us that we're kind of multidimensional, or at one point we were. At one point we had a certain power and a certain capacity. And so for consciousness, it's huge. And we don't usually, we skip over that. And we just think about like ETs, or we think about whatever, but we don't realize that we have times on this planet where we were a high civilization, where we had powers that merged with consciousness and things like that. So that's the consciousness level. For just the more material level, obviously Atlantean and post-Atlantean civilizations have technologies that are significant for humanity. These are different types of technologies that we would probably have to learn a lot about today to use, but it represents advanced consciousness, and whoever has these technologies has a lot of power. And so obviously people are going to be looking for these, trying to find them, and whatever they find, they're going to want to keep secret. They're going to want to keep in their basements and keep for themselves.
Absolutely. It's fascinating you mention it this way also, because when we look at it from the point of view of the fact that Edgar Cayce did this reading and it went on the record that Atlantis was rising. We know the mystery schools discussed this, the Steiner work, Theosophy. They opened up the Atlantis question. There was a vice presidential candidate in the 1860s named Ignatius Donnelly, who wrote Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. There were forces moving to get this Atlantis story out. And we hadn't seen such a push around it. What's fascinating, of course, is if you look at traditions like Francis Bacon, for example, you'll see that right around that period, this whole Hermetic tradition had led us up to a point where they were calling America New Atlantis. And so they wanted to reassemble all of these things that had been lost through the terrible destruction, the Apotheum destruction, as we call it, here on the X series. That devastation was so complete and eradicated so much of our progress at that point that these mystery schools decided to keep the kind of advanced information around technology and consciousness secret and only move through small groups, so that large portions of aggressive power-seeking leaders who were in Atlantis were called Belial, this Ahriman-Belial combination, versus these Amelius groups, which are using the technology like the two-eye crystal in Cayce's material in particular as an interface between spiritual activity. Now, I have some things here about what it is that Paula Zalitsky found on the ground floor of the ocean, 2,200 feet down from Cuba. But before we jump into that, Gigi, again, this idea that we're in a kind of different state that he's referring to when they're dealing with the two-eye crystal, how the Belial group is using it for massive assaults and war, while the Amelius group is using it to interface with spiritual beings from the outer sphere. Some comments about how that tradition in Atlantis would have been happening, would have been very opposite from using the technology for kind of very material ends.
Yeah, there were two paths in Atlantis, and one was moving towards obviously more of a organic technology, you could say, and the other one would be more of a regressive type of technology. When humans don't want to take responsibility for whatever's going on in their life, they'll lean into the material world too much. They'll refuse to go into the spiritual world. And that's really what was taking place in Atlantis, kind of like where we're going now with a lot of the transhumanism stuff, things like that. It's a refusal to work with nature in an organic way and technology, and the high technology of nature, which is crystalline technology that allows you to merge your consciousness with a crystalline being and accentuate yourself to the point where you are in direct communication with the outer spheres, the stars, whatever you want to call them. But it's a much different, but Atlantis was a different density, a little bit of a different density. So that's why negative beings could more use that. It's much more difficult now in that sense to have that exact technology of Atlantis here now. So that's why we're seeing the technology like a little bit different.
Do we see something in common with the civilization we're in right now and what happened during the destruction of Atlantis? Do you feel that we're in the same type of period?
We are very divided. A lot of people are experiencing a lot of division. There's a lot of illusion, and it's a lot of focus on the material end of things. And when you start focusing on the material end of things, you start getting this obsession with like projecting yourself into a computer or something rather than, you know, becoming more ethereal, more light and connecting with that. Now I'm gonna project that into a computer, and that's kind of where it's at. It's this kind of wobbly thinking. It's the same wobbly thinking in a different time. And we have to move through this Atlantis wound and make better decisions. I hear a lot of people, especially in the New Age, say that Atlantis was bad. I wasn't involved in that. And we want to remove ourselves from this. But the reality is that this is an initiation.
Yes.
We didn't pass. And so we have to do that now. And that's why we have to be awake now and understand what's really going on and not be afraid to look.
It was a destruction. It was a destructive period at the end, but obviously it had a great, incredible, maybe over 100,000-year run.
Oh, yeah.
Spiritual civilization. And the offshoots of where that Law of One group went, we know the high culture in Egypt, the echoes in Greece, the Chaldeans, you know, the high culture aspect was carried over. And even in some of those standing stone cultures that we saw in the UK and in France, that echo is there, and in the best of what the Mayans brought forward before that was also corrupted. Do you think with this reemerging that we're actually engaging not just, you know, I think people, and I've pointed out in this program, the CIA has done things like, you know, done extensive research on artifacts like Noah's Ark and engaged in these archaeology wars to get precious relics from Iraq, trying to find these kind of, you know, the sphere of destiny, like the power that's behind these things. And I have here actually, which is kind of really remarkable. And it's one of these things, we're going to show so many documents tonight, but one of the documents I have is going to demonstrate clearly through the Freedom of Information Act. In the early 1960s, the CIA quietly opened a file on Edgar Cayce's work as part of its study of Cayce's claims pertaining to the Hall of Records and the Sphinx and the ancient mysteries it may well hide. Why is the CIA interested in the Hall of Records?
Oh my gosh, the CIA is interested in the Hall of Records because they want to have that power. The Hall of Records is a technology, but the Hall of Records is basically, if you know the past, you know the future. If you have the Hall of Records, you know all of the bloodlines, you know all of the significant people, you know the patterns of time. You can, you know when something's going to happen. You can, so I mean, it's an incredible
Wow.
wealth of
Yeah, absolutely.
knowledge, but I mean, yeah.
Wow, I know. The Two-Eye Stone and the directions for the construction of the Two-Eye Stone are there in the Hall of Records? Is that the real bait for them also? Or are they thinking,
Oh,
get our hands on that thing again?
yeah. See, I wasn't aware that the directions of construction were there, because I don't know if we could construct one where we are now, because I think that the stones are conscious.
Yes.
And I think it would be more of a summoning of the stones and asking if they want to come back. But yeah, that would be my take.
That's real conscious interaction
Real conscious
you're
interaction.
getting at. It is interesting because one of the things that Cayce stressed was this period between 1958 and 1998, when a lot of the old Atlantean technology would be redeveloped, and that we would be facing that test period there. And then so that was the test period, and now we're in the after period, whatever that leads us to. But what I found out when I went in there and searched what happened in 1958 that he could be referring to, and the discovery of the laser took place in 1958. Now there's a crystal technology.
Yeah,
Directed light.
that could be it. Well, people always credit that with crash UFOs and things like that. That's often what people think that the laser is from, and some things are from, but who really knows?
Yes, absolutely. The rediscovery. Well, we have that legacy there also with the off-world civilizations. So coming back into the awareness of, for example, the Atlantean period, the high technology that's involved, and the things that Cayce was saying in 1920, talking about television and what was obviously like insanely advanced aircraft, and even saying that the Atlanteans had the ability to travel the universe. I mean, those are all quotes out of the reading in 1925. So this is somebody who was seeing this pattern come up again. But certainly a consciousness of off-world civilizations, the UFO file, the whole alien factor is part of that.
Oh yeah, and it was alive and well in Atlantis, and everything is cyclical, so everything sort of always comes back around, and all of that.
Right, right. Do you think that, Cayce actually died in 45, and the UFO flap was in 1947, for example. And a lot of the mystery school stuff, the way that I see it, is they understood things, and very often people would say, why don't they refer more to this stuff if they knew all about it? And it seems to me over and over again that they let, one of the things that they said about Steiner was, why didn't he talk about Pluto if he had this advanced mystery school information? And they are under orders, basically, of secrecy inside of those schools, not to reveal things until there's time. Humanity comes out and discovers Pluto. That's for humanity. It's not for some kind of great white brotherhood to say, hey, Pluto's out there, and, here's the blueprint for it. I mean, I think they nudge the culture along. They move it along and direct it. But it seems to me the pattern is they come out, they give this information over time, and then they withdraw to see what we'll do with it.
Yes, I believe that I do believe that they do that. And I think it's hard. I think it's hard when you're a psychic to suddenly have access to every little earthquake or every little planet that's discovered. Every psychic or every school or whatever's going on has their specialties and what they focus in. And within that, there's like a spectrum. So yeah, they're not responsible for everything, right?
Right.
And it's hard to gauge when it's time for something and when it's not as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There was just a huge earthquake outside of Anchorage, Alaska, and I was getting reports on it just before we came on the air tonight. And of course, we hope everybody is well over there. There were no reports of casualties or anything like that, but the infrastructure got shaken up, and there was a tsunami warning that eventually they let go of, but it was like a 7.2 right off the coast of Alaska. And this reminds us again, this shifting, this idea of Atlantis rising that these people were chasing after, and that we're going to get into, that Hemingway and Cayce and JFK and so many of the things around Cuba and the international's intrigue that was surfacing at that time. This is all about earth changes, because when the earth changes and earthquakes happen and lands get submerged, as has been predicted by the mystery schools over time, the other piece that we forget about is that what they predict actually is that land is going to rise. And the kind of scandal over that and people wanting to have their hands on that, we're going to get into tonight. But that's another piece of this, which is we're right in the center of it. And in a way, a big earthquake like what just happened in Alaska will remind us, you know, it's a fragile ecosystem in this sense. And there are major changes happening on the earth changes on the landmass side. So when we think about a major earthquake, or people have talked about the inundation of Los Angeles, for example, we could be looking at, over the course of the next 100 years, lands being submerged completely and completely new lands rising. That's what the Cayce readings tell us. What do you think of that?
Yes, I'm aware of the predictions around that. I always view weather and earth changes and land changes as being like a spectrum where it can be very big or it can happen gradually. And it's the earth is always moving and changing according to our consciousness and the consciousness of the cosmos. It's constantly digesting and shifting and moving, but it is moving. And depending on how we are, but there's always changes, especially around, the precession of the equinoxes and the ends of eras. Those are documented. Burnings and things like that, and floods, those are, big and small changes are documented. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of the reasons why at the end of those millenniums, you always have those movements where, they had the Millerites who were predicting the end of the world was coming. And a lot of people try to use Nostradamus stuff for that, the switch of the millennium recently. So they sense something is happening, but they just take it too far with a lot of those movements. Cayce indicated that these lands were rising. This is the first kind of crux behind tonight. And he indicated that the area was the Bahamas where this was going to take place. We get these stories around 2001 of this Cuban city that's been discovered by Paula Zalitsky and working for this company, ADC, which is Advanced Digital Communication. She's working on behalf of Castro and presumably to check out trends in oceanography. She's a very unusual history. In fact, she put out 2 biographies, Volume 1, Volume 2 in 2013, that don't even mention her find in Cuba, which I think gives you some idea of the secrecy around that, even though the original story came out, and of course there's no follow-up on it. One of the things that I found very interesting in that book is she goes into theories by real right-wingers like Alexander Haig, for example, about how Castro was involved in the JFK assassination, which is always this kind of CIA canard, that they trot out every once in a while to take the heat off themselves and what took place during the JFK assassination. But I found this particularly interesting considering this is the guy who gave her carte blanche exclusive access and found all this. There's strange inconsistencies here with the story around the Cuban ruins, and I want to point everyone out to where we're talking about. Let's get oriented on a map here, if everyone can see that. That's Bimini here, off the coast of Florida. We've got Cuba here, here's the ruins. And then around here, we have the Bahamas, and this is the general area of the Bermuda Triangle. Let's see if everyone can see that. It's pretty good. Now, what's fascinating is over here on the left side of it, I guess it's right on here, is Yucatan. And Zalitsky's contention was that there was a land bridge between Yucatan and Cuba. So we get some idea that when we're talking about Yucatan and what Cayce said about it, let's go into the mindset that he was saying there's 3 sets of halls of records. And they all come from Atlantis, and the 3 records are one. One of them is under the Sphinx in Egypt, under the Sphinx right paw that leads to a chamber of these hall of records. And we saw that the CIA, one thing I didn't mention is the CIA not only had a file open on this, but in the 70s used remote viewers to see if they could look at and see what was in that hall of records. But he said the other 2 locations were the Temple of Iltar in Yucatan, and the other one was in a sunken temple of Poseidia off the coast of Bimini. So we have Zalitsky finding this civilization under Cuba at 2,200 feet depth. And we have the Bimini Wall, which I'll show a picture of that here. I have another picture, but we'll take a look at this one. Temple blocks. This is only in about 20 feet of submerged water off of Bimini. And then the work, which I'll also bring in from a book called The Stones of Atlantis, which is one of the best books done on the underwater researchers around this. This is Dr. David Zink's pillar. And David Zink was one of the best oceanographers who went after this. And he looked into all the theories. He used the impressions of psychic archaeology. He had a great academic background. And he really pressed forward until his basically health issues caused him to stop. One of the things that he found, and which was confirmed by photographs, was a lit column, which would actually light up what the entire ocean floor there, which was completely dark. There's a picture of it here. And this pillar, which would emit light, he felt was associated with these ruins that they were discovering off of Bimini. And that book actually is called The Stones of Atlantis by David Zink. And it's been out for a long time, actually. I think it came out 25 years ago. They put out a revised version of it recently. Absolutely fascinating, cutting-edge research dropped in the public eye, but somebody continued with that research. Gigi, a pillar that can light up the ocean floor. What kind of leftover technology?
What a thing to see. Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, it sounds like it's almost alive.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's emitting something. Maybe it's communicating. Maybe it's sending energy. Who knows what that thing's doing down there?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. Emitting energy, light. When I think of the Two-Eye Stone, obviously it commanded a great deal of light. There's so many stories that we get out of the Bermuda Triangle that relate to the fact that that area, over and over again during World War II, would take planes down, would take ships down. They would disappear. But sometimes the reports were very strange. The people would hear in their final communications, they would say things like, we're hearing weird sounds, we're going into zones of light. I want to ask you the possibility, because we've gone over the possibilities of the Two-Eye Stone being active and still being in reverse and pulling that landmass down, and so that magnetic polarity happening. When somebody goes into a field like that, like with the Bermuda Triangle, if they're going into these fields of light and it's a different dimension, what happens to them? I mean, is that it in terms of the physical existence? Do they continue on? Or what do you think happens when they go into this zone of something like the Bermuda Triangle and their physical reality experiences this kind of Apotheum effect?
Well, every effect like that is going to be generated by some type of consciousness or energy. So I would assume that that energy is going to be at different strengths at different times. So not every person that is going into that is going to experience the same experience. If it's really, really strong, I think you could get anything from time, losing time, showing up somewhere else, but you're basically flying into a vortex, and it's going to have a lot to do with your consciousness. And it's going to have a lot to do with, everything that's going on in the galactic element as well. So
do you think they're actually moving into another dimension?
Yeah, I do. I do feel like it depends on I always see, whenever I have visions about planes going down or things like that, whenever I've read anything about this on what we're working on here, I always see it as a yellow energy. I have no idea why, but it's always like this yellow beam of energy that kind of comes up and something weird happens. So, and then just kind of goes black, and it goes gray, actually, not black, gray. And I don't know what happens. I've never followed it, but that is not the same. It's not the same place, that's for sure.
It's fascinating because there is someone who came back from it, who was a very famous pilot, and he described being in what looked like a long tunnel cloud, and there was kind of a goldish color to it. And he knew that he only had so much fuel to get back with. And he realized the time had run out and that he was going to hit water. But he actually started to feel like completely lightheaded in there. And when he came out the other side of the cloud, his position was completely different and his fuel gauge hadn't changed at all, even though he felt he was in there for hours. So I guess it gives us some idea what's going on over there.
Well, there was a story very similar to that it was like a guy going through a cloud. I don't think they mentioned the gold or yellow or anything like that, but he was going through a cloud. He had another guy with him, and he looked down and he saw dinosaurs.
Wow.
And if anyone in chat know what I'm talking about, this, but very similar to your story.
That is time, yes.
Yeah. Have you heard this? And he looks down and he sees dinosaurs, and it's right where the airport should be because he recognized the land. And then he's like freaking out and he's flying, and then he comes back around and he goes through the same cloud and he comes back and like the airport is there again.
Unbelievable.
Does anyone know what I'm talking about in chat? That's another weird story. I totally forgot about that until you mentioned that.
Amazing. Miss Olivia.
What they're all saying is that it sounds like a Twilight Zone
episode. Yes, it's true. But we know.
Oh yeah, no, that was on Twilight Zone too. Yes. But it was in a little. It was also in like a book as well, like a true account book. Yeah.
But there's also that idea that so many of the episodes were drawn from real experiences.
They were.
Absolutely, yeah. But that is fascinating. When we get into it, the way that Cayce describes it is so off the charts anyway in terms of what it can do. So he's talking about it and he's saying, well, the two-eye stone was unintentionally at the end tuned too highly because basically the Belial group was using it for destroying these other lands, and that it basically fell into reverse. That one of the things it was great for was levitating all this stuff, and they had all these lighter-than-air vehicles flying around, and that this basically turned the entire thing upside down and set off volcanic explosions. That's one side of what we understand. Okay, we understand from our 21st century level an incredibly disastrous technological mayhem event. But he also says, well, the two-eye stone was used to interface with higher beings, and they would train priestesses to move through the two-eye stone and interact with beings from the outer spheres, quote unquote. So this is a very different technology. This is not like nuclear power or something along that line. We're talking about a very different, highly refined kind of energy.
Yeah, you're talking, it's a completely different energy that uses your consciousness. Like, we laugh at this now. Like, we laugh at things like like law of resonance or law of attraction or merging with crystals or,
right.
Kind of like mysticism and stuff, but it's a real thing. And Atlanteans took it very seriously. And a lot of the higher societies, they completely ruled by merging with their higher self and higher group selves to move with the cosmos in a way that was healthy. And so it wasn't from ego at all. It was kind of connecting with a higher chain of consciousness.
Right. It's not the kind of thing where, well, the way the Amelia's group used it, they never thought of it in terms of threatening technology.
Oh.
So, yeah. So it's a kind of an interesting downward spiral that kicks in there with that Ahriman Belial influence using it, getting us into a kind of density and thinking of that scientific materialism, that strip, kind of getting us down into that. That's where a lot of that slide sounds like it started.
Yeah. Yeah. Taking something and kind of, you do all this work to get to a certain place, and then some bad apples kind of get in there and start using the group's energy and the group's power in a way that's all dirty and stuff. And it's, it ruins it for everybody.
Wow.
So
dirty, I think is a good, because it actually is, it's dirty energy, I guess, if you think about it. It is. Absolutely.
It is. And I think that, I think that they were using that good energy and funneling it into very negative portals and very negative things, and opening very negative portals too, with that crystal. So it wasn't just like nailing other countries that I don't like. It was also like opening portals to the lower astral and doing that stuff too. So
right, absolutely. I want to remind everyone, this is fascinating. We're getting that foundation of what Atlantis, ancient Atlantis, is about, and what the Two-Eyes Stone was about. We are certainly referring more to the destruction aspect of it, and we're not spending so much time in the higher part of the culture. But we're getting this idea that around this period of time, say 10,500 BC is when Cayce says the final islands of Atlantis went down. Plato, when he's talking and getting this information, and Solon says, actually it's 9,000 years before you guys. Well, that's 9,500 BC. So we're getting an idea that these timelines are merging and adding up. One of the things that Graham Hancock did so successfully was apply archaeoastronomy to the Sphinx, and found that in 10,500 it would actually be sitting there in Egypt looking out at the constellation of Leo, which would make sense since Leo is the lion. So now a lot of these things on the ground are starting to make sense, and a lot of the really podunk research that Egyptology did, for example, which goes back largely to the 18th century, when we didn't even have the technological tools to study these things. A lot of that Egyptian history that we got from that, by the way, a lot of it even before we understood hieroglyphs. So, you know, it's kind of like that history needs to be rewritten for us to understand the real history behind Egypt, which is a totally different, I mean, how different is it, Gigi, in your estimation, ancient Egypt in 10,500 BC versus the types of consciousness that we exist with now in the 21st century?
wow. I think it was really different. And when I remember back to that time period, it was kind of moving away, starting to move away from Atlantis, but you still had a lot of it, and you were trying to kind of ground whatever you could and bring forward whatever you could as a memory, but it was still falling a little bit. We were still dropping, but it was kind of like in between. But I feel like these societies like Egypt and the Yucatan, they're kind of trying to deposit everything they can remember about Atlantis, and because they knew that they were going to forget, and they knew that they were going to have to try again.
They were losing this kind of Camelot. They were losing this magic period.
They were losing the energy. The density was shifting and becoming heavier, and they knew they were going to start forgetting, generation after generation, forgetting. And so they wanted to leave things for themselves. We were leaving things for ourselves. But it would have been this kind of twilight, you know, the twilight after Atlantis. You know, that's when those societies were, and you see them moving away, and then you see them losing it, but carrying certain things, and yeah.
My God, we have the emblems of their airships, and it's like this weird echo. It's almost this sad thing when you look at it. And those people, after a while, were probably like, "What is that? We don't even know what that is. Is that a bird?" You know?
Right? Like, yeah, exactly. And
we have to imagine too our own society being wiped out. And I go back to this earthquake that happened tonight, because really, you know, an earthquake, something that would knock us off the grid, God forbid, a major destruction, would really send us back. You know, it wouldn't be too hard to send us back into a Stone Age style existence. And then so many of the things that we take for granted now in the level of civilization that we have now would just be some kind of weird echo of a memory. So we're in this interesting phase, and I think we've outlined pretty well this switch out period when Atlantis fell. So now let's talk about the ruins that were there. Miss Olivia, before we go any further.
Well, that's a perfect opportunity to bring up what everybody is chatting about tonight,
Yes.
which the observer was asking, strange that the seismic wave happened right before the earthquake.
Right, so there was a seismic wave that they isolated all the way on the other side of the ocean, actually. I think it was somewhere in the Mediterranean.
No, I think it was off the coast of Africa.
Yeah, okay, that's what it was. Yeah, it's right over there. And they found this seismic wave, and it went around the world. Now, I do sometimes worry about stories like this, and I'll tell you why. Because I think that they are the types of stories, even though there's a real scientific basis for them, that kind of lead us around in a weird circle. So I haven't spent too much time concentrating on it. It's just an interesting kind of National Geographic type story out there. But it was interesting that shortly before this major kickoff happened with this earthquake that we had this. So that is quite unusual. Do you have any other questions you want to pop in?
Well, there's just so many. Just where do we want
Okay,
to
well, it's going to be very simple tonight. We're going to go Atlantis, Bimini, Cayce, JFK. You don't need anything else but that as your core. And those are the questions. I want to remind everyone, too, to ask the questions in caps, because on the second half of the program, we're going to answer them in earnest. But right now, we're just going to take a couple. But ask the questions in caps. They're easier to catch that way, and it helps us tremendously. At the same time, don't use caps otherwise, because that just makes it difficult to pick out what's going to be important. The categories for questions really tonight, we're going to go deep into the Atlantis part. We're going into these reports. We are looking at information that's changing history. And we're going to get this background on the psychic archaeology side from Gigi Young, who's been, really working closely with us on this. And I want to remind everyone to also go to gigiyoung.com. She's doing a course there. And this is an intuitive training course, Gigi, that you're doing. This sounds fascinating.
Yeah, so I teach intuition development if you're interested, and I've just actually broken it up into modules. So before it was like one whole 6-week thing, but now you can take it one module at a time. You can hang out with me once a month and we chat as a group. There's forums, come on down.
It's fantastic. It's a great time, and it's a learning time. There's nothing really quite like it, I have to say. So I highly recommend it. And I think this is something that's happening too with the emergence of 2019. I think real tools are going to start to be available. Real information is available. A lot of the circus is in town vibe that got unleashed on us with Gaia TV and all the kind of junk culture around that, I think we see that sort of dimming off the front. And we see some really significant information coming forward through Catherine Austin Fitz, through Alexandra Bruce at Forbidden Knowledge TV, Joseph Farrell at Giza Death Star. We have the people, we have the material. Let's move this entire culture of alternative research in a good direction and get the real information. And for what we're doing with the X series, it seems to me, from all my research and the time I've spent on it, that the mystery schools vouchsafe something very important for us in this period. And that's really where we're moving into. And it seems like this piece involving Hemingway and Edgar Cayce and JFK is quite significant relating to the Cuban find. So we're going to go deep on that aspect. Before we go further, I will let you have a few questions here, though.
Okay. So I think this is great. Lancelot
How's
Cole,
your technology doing?
It's working fine. Lancelot Cole says, we are living in our own version of the Twilight Zone. Will we free ourselves from it? And Jesse McCartney says, the Earth is going through birthing pains and we get to hold on for the ride. And I just wanted to get Gigi's thoughts on all that.
Nice.
So we're going through the Twilight Zone. Are we going to get through it? Yeah, we're going to get through it. Heck yeah, we're going to get through it, you guys. We can do this. Look where we are. We're hanging out. We're talking about Hemingway. We're, all this stuff. We're absolutely going to get through it. But you have to have tools. Go out in nature, walk around, meditate, be in your heart, be kind, be present. Don't watch garbage news. We have all the tools to get through anything. And just remember that.
We have the tools. I like that. Yeah.
And if you don't feel like you have it, we live in the perfect age to just Google something and just apply it the best that you possibly can. Try to find something, a good book or whatever, ask a friend. We have so much information now.
Incredible access. Absolutely. Miss Olivia.
Gigi, you said something to me on Twitter that really struck a chord. And I wanted to ask you about timelines and about because I think that is actually the key to 2019 and us moving forward as a community, is how do you attune yourself into the timeline that you want to see manifest?
Great question. So it's really key to understand that we don't share a future. We want to, but that's a materialist approach. There are many futures. that we switch into moment to moment all the time, right? That's how reality is set up. And we switch into these timelines or futures based on our personal resonance. What is that? This is our mind. The thoughts that we think emit a resonance. They're layers of resonance. And if, a clairvoyance can see that, they can see the resonance, they can feel it, and it's either inharmonic or it's not. You're either discordant or you're not, or somewhere in that scale. The second thing is your feelings, your heart, your emotions. Where are they? Are you angry all day? Are you sad all day? Are you stressed? Or are you constantly coming back and observing stress and trying to get yourself back into a state of neutrality? This makes up your harmonic. Don't get too low. It's okay to feel badly. It's okay to feel poorly, but don't let yourself get too low, and know you can observe those things. When you can do that, you can begin to automatically shift into the higher timelines that are ahead of you. And you know that you're doing this when you see synchronicities. Synchronicities are really important. It means that you're shifting. A lot of the times, number synchronicities will come up. You may start to see a little bit differently, notice more colors vibrantly. You'll start to pick up when you're switching. A lot of the times, it also takes going to sleep and then waking up, and you'll notice that you've shifted. Because when we sleep, we reset ourselves. So there's a lot of different things about this that would take too long tonight, but basically watch your mind and watch your emotions. If you can get into neutrality, you can shift into the higher timelines for you in this moment. Does that make sense?
Fantastic. Absolutely. What's amazing about that too is you can feel that this thing you're saying about a choice too, I think is important, because so often I think even in the alternative research space, there's that going round and round on the negative topics, or this negative politician. And that turns into like a 2 minutes hate type thing, what they used to do in 1984, where everyone comes out and expresses this hate and negative emotion against this big screen, and then they go back to their lives and they live in this kind of brainwashed state. I think what's fascinating is we shouldn't take, a big thing about 2019 maybe coming up is that we shouldn't take the bait, that we should redirect where our focus goes, because really what you focus on grows. And so that's what I hear you saying there. And a great way to do it is right through the work that you're doing and that we're doing here. So I want to remind everyone that you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going to go deep now into the Hemingway, Atlantis, Bimini, JFK connection. Atlantis Rising is the theme. And we're doing quite a few episodes now on this because the information is growing. This is where we're going to spend our focus, especially for the rest of the year, right here on the Hemingway Atlantis connection. And of course, we're here with Gigi Young, and Gigi Young's worked closely with us on it. I want to say this, where a lot of this comes from on the Hemingway side. I was very aware of the Cayce Hemingway connection, with his mother being close to Edgar Cayce and getting a reading for him and for herself. And there are other things there. I have a reading that I'm going to read some letters around that she wrote to him afterwards that'll give us some idea of that relationship. But I want to actually begin at the beginning, which is that sometime over the summer when I was working with you, Gigi, we were working on CERN and things relating to the Orphic Circle. And at the end of our conversation, you said something interesting. You said, "Oh yeah, and for whom the bell tolled." And I said, that's right. Yeah, for whom the bell tolls. What exactly do you mean? And then you were like, well, for whom the bell tolls. And I was like, yeah. I wrote that down, and you were like, that's what I'm getting, for whom the bell tolls. And then we hung out in space with that, and it came back, actually. And it came back when we did this thing about these three hairs in a circle, and where that came from an ancient culture. We got this again, and we were talking, and you said, "Oh yeah, and by the way, for whom the bell tolls." So this is an absolutely fascinating chain of events that led us to this point. But obviously, the information that you were getting when we were looking at this, somehow, for whom the bell tolls was the phrase, and it wound up relating directly to Ernest Hemingway and his connection to all these events. How does that work as a psychic when something comes in like that and there's no background for it?
It happens all the time. There's different levels of psychic information. The only things that is consistent is that you're like a beacon, and anything that's resonant is coming in. And it could be resonant for right now, so that you can research it, or maybe it's what you're looking for, or it could be for months from now. But sometimes an answer right now is medicine, or right now it adjusts you in a certain way to look in a certain direction. And so it was definitely like discordant. It was definitely coming in, but I had no idea what it was. It wasn't really around anything. And JFK would kind of come in randomly too, like weird, and other things would come in, but they didn't congeal until now.
Yeah, right. There wasn't really a narrative to them. They were fragmented parts, but they were important. We could both feel they were important.
Yeah, because anything that comes around is coming around because either it's coming, or it's not, or you're gonna run into something. You're gonna be driving, and you're gonna see a Hemingway sign, and you need to see this, or it's got something. There's something there with it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm going to tell everyone a little secret that Olivia knows, which is this afternoon I talked to a national news network about the Ernest Hemingway story, and the kind of wings, the weight that this story has as it gets out. We're only just seeing the very beginning of it, but I can tell you from those few whispers that we had about it when we were first talking about it, For Whom the Bell Tolls was quite compelling. I'm going to show this, which is what was on display when I was at the JFK Museum, was this Hemingway aspect, and they were spotlighting For Whom the Bell Tolls. There was just no question about it. That was the book that they were really focusing on. The other book that they had in there, To Have and To Have Not, they were displaying the foreign language version. This was really the centerpiece, For Whom the Bell Tolls. And when you go back into his history, For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Old Man and the Sea, the things that Hemingway was doing, we get an idea of the depth of the man. This was not somebody, we understand his general character as a person who, loved a good fight, loved a good drink, and loved to be out there on the sea, loved to live it up. He was an ambulance driver during World War I in Italy, and he was injured in that period. And so many of the things in his life that brought him into these different experiences, we can see that he's a very unique individual. That much is apparent from his work. The behind-the-scenes aspects that we're finding out about his mother's relationship with Cayce, his brother Les founding the New Atlantis and searching and apparently finding, being the first person to find this Cuban city. That's something else we're going to talk about tonight. What kind of impressions were you getting when you were looking at this Hemingway aspect and bringing it in? You were actually seeing him as somebody who was naturally psychic.
Yeah, I'm spilling the beans.
Yes, you are.
He was a psychic. He was a mystic, and he came from a mystical family. Hemingway came from a mystical family and a special family, and they had a lot of information. I'll just say that. Yeah. And they had access to information, not necessarily from a book, but the way that some people can be claircognizant and access it from their own energy.
Right.
From their own times.
Yes. Well, you saw him as somebody who could almost channel information.
That's right. Yeah. And the best writers are. The best writers can feel right up into the collective consciousness and right up into their genius and write things that touch people and that are pertinent to the time, where you can get layers and layers and layers of information from. You know that that person is a claircognizant psychic, and that's exactly what he was.
That's an excellent point, actually. I'm going to pull out his mother's reading here briefly, and we're going to take a look at a few pictures. Let's see if this strikes everyone as odd. By the way, For Whom the Bell Tolls is a book that Fidel Castro decided was his very favorite book of all time. But Castro had more things to say about it. He said that he had used the book as a manual for his revolution. Quite interesting. And what he says here, in that quote, which I will read, is kind of fascinating. He says, "I must have read it at least 3 times, and I was familiar with the movie. As guerrillas in the Sierra, we always came back to the book for inspiration." Gigi, the beginning of the Castro Hemingway dance.
It is.
Quite interesting.
I mean, I'm sure it's a wonderful book. Sure, it's just wonderful. But that's a really deep thing to say. He's like, I was strategizing from it. And it's like, you're saying something from saying something.
He's acknowledging it, understanding his own position as a historical figure. He's giving it that gravitas. There's another major political figure who gave Hemingway that gravitas, and that's John F. Kennedy. And we're going to get into that tonight. Here is Ernest Hemingway on the sea there, going from Bimini to Cuba. Later in his life, he had collected his Nobel Prize for Literature and had donated it to the Cuban people. Gives you some idea of the real character of the man. Early in life, there were some very interesting aspects, but let's take a look at his mother, Grace, here before we bring in her Cayce reading. This is Grace, and that's Ernest there on the end. Oddly enough, Gigi, one of the things you found fascinating is how they dressed Ernest when he was younger.
Yeah, I thought that was a little, I don't even know how I came across it. This is strange. They actually dressed Ernest like a little girl, and they called him like Fupy or something. I can't make it up.
Yes.
Okay? Yeah. Like they actually dressed, I guess she wanted him to be a little girl, and she called him Fupy and put him in dresses. I'm serious.
It's something apparently he kind of never forgave her for, but it is interesting when you look at his life and how he was always living a man's life and always putting himself to the kind of macho test. It does give you some, I think, insights into his character. Let's take a look at some letters. I want to say that we have a silent partner in relation to the X series, and it's Gladys Davis from the Cayce readings. Now, Gladys Davis is no longer here with us, but she was the woman who kept details of all the readings for Edgar Cayce when he was alive, and she had her own incredible contribution to his work, and lived on for many years, helping the ARE catalog those readings. When I go through the Edgar Cayce readings, the notes and the supplements that Gladys Davis contributes in this is incredibly helpful and is quite a gold mine of research for us, quite a resource. So Gladys, thank you for all the work that you've done. So what she says here, she's talking about when she first encounters him, she's giving Cayce some idea of her background, and she says something quite fascinating, because she says, I've been told a few things by great souls. This is Grace Hall Hemingway now speaking to Edgar Cayce via letter. And she says, I've been told a few things by great souls in the master's service, and some of them have wanted me to write for them. Grace Hemingway is known as a fantastic artist, but she wasn't really known for her writing so much. And she says, Professor William James, who remember is Gertrude Stein's mentor, and she comes up basically keeping Hemingway there in Paris and being his mentor. And also we're going to find out a young John F. Kennedy sought out Gertrude Stein and had been at Harvard when she was there teaching, but he sought her out in Paris. So she says, some of them have wanted me to write for them, Professor William James and Dr. Talmadge. We'll get into him later also. Painters have wanted me to paint. Painters have wanted to paint through me. Interesting. The last name, Rubens, helped me to achieve, so I'm told. But I am not psychic and have been unable to connect with these great artists who have crossed the river. Now, interestingly enough, it's interesting that she's saying to Cayce she's not psychic, because what Les will relay is that over and over again, when things would happen, she did exhibit this kind of psychic ability. For example, when Ernest Hemingway went down in a plane and all the reports said, oh, he's gone down in a plane crash, he and his wife are dead. And Les went to tell her the news, and she said, no, he's not dead. So psychically, she understood that. She had that connection. But one of the things that she says is she's going through here, and she's talking about, I am the mother of 6 grown-up children, all married and all possessing great talents. I'm not happy about the future of them. So she's exhibiting some concern here. She says, my oldest son is the well-known novelist Ernest Hemingway. With his great ability, he ought to be a power to move the world toward the kingdom of God on earth. Again, the master, the kingdom of God, heavily religious overtones. I'll not take your time with further details, but just ask you to hurry with this reading. What a joy it will be for me to meet you in the heavenly kingdom. Really big, again, almost mystery school style language. So Cayce gives her the reading, and I'm going to go through some elements of the reading here. Now, what you have to understand from the Cayce readings is that he views Raphael, the incredible painter, as a reincarnation of John the Baptist. So an incredibly spiritual person who was an Essene and connected through his reincarnations through all these mystery schools. So he calls her a very close, she has a very close relationship with Raphael, and she inspires him through this life, giving us some idea in her past lives of who she was. And so a few pieces of this. He said, as indicated from the abilities of the entity in the days when Raphael made for activities in the earth, you were in close association there, and they were even inspirational for those activities. Thus, the beauty of nature, the abilities to depict the beauties of nature in art, are a part of your own heritage, and lucky indeed may be those who may someday have the works of thy hands, for they should one day almost be as precious as Raphael's in the eyes of those who really enjoy God's pictures of nature. A very flowery language for a reading, which, you know, the readings can really drill down the information, but they're kind of laying out the red carpet for her here. It's quite interesting. What I found particularly interesting is when she went further into those past lives, she was associated with the activities in the Temple of Sacrifice and the Temple of the Temple Beautiful, which were set up by Rata in Egypt during this period of the Atlanteans coming in after the sinking of Atlantis. So there's the direct link in the Cayce reading to this Rata Atlantis period and Grace Hemingway, who is Ernest Hemingway's mother. We're starting to get an idea of why this family may be associated with this. And Gigi, maybe just give us some idea of these reincarnation patterns. If I'm back there and I'm coming from this Atlantean lifetime into Egypt, when I come back and it's the 20th century and the world is so different, I carry some of the stamp, the pattern of that period.
You do. And that's the point of reincarnation, is to add on like a string of pearls every single time that you incarnate. You can't take everything with you, you know, but you'll choose what's significant, what memories are significant, whatever you can, and then you'll compress it into 3D reality. And it's an art. Reincarnation is an art because you have to, you know, choose the right things to bring with you, you know, as a tool.
Right.
So, yeah. And you have teams that help you with your reincarnation as well.
You come back as a group reincarnation.
Yeah, absolutely. You come back as a group, you have karma, you have relationships with people, and you have people that remind you who you are, that you probably wouldn't remember unless you were reintroduced to that frequency at a certain time. And so you do incarnate in groups, you orbit each other, and you hope to continue doing the work that you've always done.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. Miss Olivia.
Well, actually, in the chat, they were talking about the Johnny Cash song, A Boy Named Sue.
Oh, no.
Yeah, no, actually, it's
right.
pretty deep. I
Yes.
mean, you could interpret that if that was a contract between a man and his son, you know, that he needed to be strong, right? You know, to be a real man, and that, you know, it's interesting. It can be taken on a couple different levels.
Oh, there's no question about it. Yeah. The original gender bender,
Yeah.
Johnny Cash. What's fascinating is further on in this reading, and I'm going to curtail it. It's a fascinating reading, and I highly recommend it. Her number for the Cayce readings is 3954. So it's pretty easy to find when you look it up. This is publicly available through the Cayce library. The ARE down there in Virginia Beach, which is a fantastic place to visit. We spent a lot of time there, and I had the great opportunity of meeting Edgar Cayce there and having some excellent conversations with him and Charles Thomas Cayce. So she asked a question. She said, with my son, Ernest, how can I best help him? This is 1943. Cayce answers this. He says, when you were in the Egyptian land where you contributed and added to the light in which he became the active force in tempering the lives of others. In adding to it in the present, speak gently, never harshly. For some day he may come to you, yet in humbleness, thanking you for what you have been through time. So Cayce's giving her this impression that back there in Egypt, she was helping him bring this light to people. And then he's associating her with this period of Rata and the Temple Beautiful and Temple Sacrifice, which was such an important period there in Egypt when they were, Rata was introducing this kind of solution to the Belial problem and really bringing back that Emilius thing and creating the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid and all the rest of it. So we're getting some impression here, Gigi, that the story runs deep, as you said, the family and the personage of Ernest Hemingway. Not just a great writer, but somebody really there as a large spiritual influence in the culture.
Yeah, he did, and we have to think as well when a culture is maybe. Actually, it doesn't even matter where the culture is. One of the best ways to wake people up is often through fiction or through stories. It just is. It just is. It's much easier to wake people up through telling them a story or through a movie, and it just bypasses your logical mind, but you get it, And so that's really, you could argue that's what he was doing. It's like he assessed his life and was like, this is how I'm going to do it in this life. And of course, his lineage is going to be, it's going to need to be at a certain harmonic for him to come in. So he's going to have certain genes and certain a certain bloodline or whatever to hold his spirit, because all of that makes up a certain earth harmonic that he would need as well.
I'm getting the impression that Cayce is saying to her, you are an extraordinary person, and in this life you're extraordinary. And he's saying you're associated with Raphael and you have that ability to bring that spirit through your art. And then we have Ernest there associated with her in that background. So these are quite extraordinary people. I think that's the impression that we're getting.
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah.
It seems like it. And at the end of the reading, there's a letter follow-up and an exchange of letters. And Hewlin Cayce talks about going to Chicago. Hewlin Cayce ran the ARE. He's Cayce's son. His other son is Edgar Evans and Hewlin. And Hewlin writes this letter back and forth with Grace saying, it was so wonderful to see your paintings in Chicago and to observe your art. And she sends him some things back, and she sends them some things to Cayce saying, you're a gift from God and all this kind of stuff. And they talk about their mutual associations in a wide circle of social contacts. And Cayce, of course, very humbly says, well, it's not me that does it. It's just what acts through me, and I can't take any credit. It's very classic Cayce. But the exchange demonstrates something, the extreme closeness of Grace Hall Hemingway and Edgar Cayce. That's important, and I think we need to get that really established on the record. I think we did that here so that we understand the next picture when we move in, that we're not going off on some tangent with Hemingway. He's closely associated with the Cayce readings. Cayce is talking in this period about Bimini being Atlantis rising. It just so happens in this period of time that Hemingway takes all these boat trips, and he is going by boat, and he's looking underwater over and over again, and people start to wonder and get almost suspicious. What's he doing all this time? And finally, he has to come out with a public statement saying, oh, I'm looking for German U-boats during World War II, which doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense, frankly. So he's looking for these ruins, and his brother, Les, will become obsessed with finding Atlantis, carving out lots in the Atlantic Ocean, calling it New Atlantis. These people are plugging into this Cayce vision of Atlantis rising there at Bimini. And that's going to tie us into what Hemingway's doing in Cuba.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to move right along. Let's take a look at a few pictures of Hemingway in his famous villa there. And I think what's fascinating about this Finca Vehia, which actually means final vision, there's a very lovely shot of that light coming through and him spending his later years there before he left Cuba, apparently due to the revolution. And one of the things, as we started the show off with, is that he left there a vault, which the Kennedy administration needed to get back, and that Hemingway's wife really wanted to get back. A few more pictures of Hemingway. Olivia, this one's for you because there's that famous cat that he loves so much. And
one of many.
Down in the Keys, a very special cat fetish that Ernest had. And looking unusually happy there in that period. I want to introduce a couple of interesting things because we've talked about this family and the things that have happened with it. And Mariel Hemingway actually is an extraordinary actress and model. And she's come forward to say that the Kennedys and the Hemingways seem to share something, Gigi, which is this incredible curse around their families. And what I read into that was actually a little bit different, which is, isn't it extraordinary with all these gifts, all the incredible difficulties that have been laid on these people who seem to be more about freedom and freedom of ideas? It almost seems like those types of tragedies have been engineered on them.
Yeah, they have been. I don't think that anybody can question that.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think there's a question there. Anyone who looks into it will realize that a lot of these things are done in a ceremonial way.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, people are just not the people watching, obviously, but there's many people who are not aware of the occult. They're not aware of how rhythms are used, how symbols are used, dates, times, things like this. And once you start looking into that, things start standing out. The Kennedys stand out, the Hemingways stand out.
Absolutely. The Hemingway sisters here, who would go through a lot of tragedy, and of course we lost Margot Hemingway, who was a deep, deep person who traced her grandfather Ernest's footsteps going to Pamplona, really trying to get a hint of his life. And then there was Mariel looking up to her big sister, and Mariel was named after a port in Cuba that was a favorite of Hemingway's. Oddly enough, Mariel Hemingway was born on November 22nd, 1961, and 2 years after she was born, on the same day, of course, the Kennedy assassination happened. Strange parallel there, for sure, one of many. And an idea, a glimpse of them later in life, just achieving that incredible fame, which Mariel would later say that although she achieved all these things, what she was really looking for was to be happy in life. So we're going to go deeper into the extraordinary people that they are, but I'm just giving some idea of this family. This, again, the Finca Vehia there, the opening to that incredible site of this Hemingway ranch. And the interesting thing about this ranch is it's going to become the focus of a national security meeting between Major General Edward Lansdale, who's known for coup d'etat activity with backing from the CIA everywhere from Indonesia to Cuba. And he will show up as a major figure in the JFK assassination through the personage of Fletcher Prouty, identifying him as being in Dealey Plaza during the assassination. And oddly enough, when we get into Lansdale, it's a deep story because he's in thick, truly thick with the CIA. And Lansdale quit the Air Force and his post there as a liaison with the CIA shortly before the Kennedy assassination. In fact, he left government military service on October 31st, 1963, just 3 weeks before the assassination. Quite unusual. And the document that we have is unassailable. That is, it's been declassified. So therefore, when we present it tonight, there's no veracity questions about it. any news agency will agree with it, and I've checked it out with several. A couple of interesting, kind of amusing things I want to mention about the ranch is that this is very interesting, Gigi, because before I had shown you this picture, you had identified a couple of things that are in it when you were tuning in. One of them were these incredible horns up here, but something very interesting was on this table that you kept seeing, which was a key. I thought that was very interesting in terms of psychic imagery.
Yeah, the horns look exactly the same as what I saw them. The keys appeared a little differently, but
Yeah.
there it is.
Wow. I know. I'm going to show that again here. Here are the horns. And I was asking Gigi, what do you see when you're tuning into him being at the ranch? And she said, well, I see these horns and I see a key. Show me where the key is. And the key was right here in the picture. So this is some of the incredible psychic archaeology that we've seen Gigi Young do many times in the show. I'm always amazed by it, though, and I never take it for granted. And that was a particularly interesting one because I think it got us to a different place in thinking about this also. Let's keep moving. Did Castro and Hemingway meet? Yes. That's on the record. And Castro, as we found out, had incredible respect for Whom the Bell Tolls. It was his favorite book, and he used it as a blueprint for his own revolution. Kind of interesting. Our friend Hemingway leaves shortly after the revolution, and he leaves his ranch there, and it becomes something of an interesting political football. But there's another reason for that, which has to do with this vault, where Hemingway has kept information relating to X. What would be so important in this vault? It wasn't about stories and short stories. Obviously, there was a whole different degree of information that he was sealing up in that vault, and this becomes a major mystery because with Kennedy's help, Mary Hemingway, his widow, was able to get that out. But the mystery of what it was is still why we're talking about this and why the Hemingway exhibit shows up at the JFK Library, etc. So we're going deep on this end now. One of the things I wanted to point out, which, and this was great too, because when I went to the Kennedy Library, I went with Kate Schneider, and I mentioned this in the last episode because she did a great job herself doing her own investigation of the things that we were looking at there. And she knew that I was kind of trancing out on this map and really getting into, because there's a lot of things wrong with the map that we're looking at here, which is about Cuba and nuclear activity. One of the things was the dispersion bothered me a lot about what they were demonstrating there. But also there's this strange, this might be hard to see on camera, but there's a strange triangle that they point at, and it's right here, these two lines. And it seems to be like they're creating their own Bermuda Triangle, but on the other side. But luckily enough, we did, she got a picture of it, and I was too busy being fascinated by it. So we do have that on hand now. This little map is going to come in handy as we move forward. So let's take a look now at someone else who liked to fish off Bimini. I wonder, Gigi, if you can tell me who that is fishing off Bimini.
Oh, that's Cayce. Is that Cayce?
It is, yeah.
Oh my! Look at him with a marlin.
You know, we're going deep into it. We've got a couple of fishermen here, and this is going to come in handy, I think, getting a feel for who these people are. I want to remind everyone.
Very peaceful to go fishing, I have to say. I like fishing.
Yes, yes. Well, you naturally spend a lot of time in nature. This is part of what you do, right?
Yeah. Yes.
This is a big part of who you are. Let's take a quick look at a couple of images of Cayce. The man who could really penetrate through time and had worked with the mystery schools through many lifetimes and brought us a really succinct, complete story of Atlantis that we just weren't getting in other material. Of course, doing all the medical readings that he had done through the years and really being the father of holistic medicine, his great psychic ability, kind of a blueprint, Gigi, of service there with his psychic ability.
Yeah, there's nobody really like Cayce. You know, he obviously struggled in his life to manage his gifts and stuff, but I think it was his pure heart that allowed him to go as far as he could go.
It is. That is the whole thing about being tried by fire. And it's tough because you feel like when people have these abilities, when you look at their lives, you're like, why did they have to go through such struggle financially, personally, tragedy? Even when you look at the Kennedys, I mean, they had everything delivered to them on a silver platter. But, you know, John lost his older brother Joe in a plane crash in World War II. He lost his sister in a plane crash. You know, he's assassinated. Robert's assassinated. Ted's plane goes down and breaks his back. And then he has Chappaquiddick and ruins his political future. I mean, quite a lot of tragedy. And yet the great gifts. It's like this very fascinating combination of things we were talking about.
Yeah, well, I think that we're in a bit of a night. I think that we're in a nighttime, and I think that it's easier at this point in time to do dark things and to be dark, but it always shifts because there's a kind of like, it's kind of like the Mayan day and night. And there's a time for both. I think it's harder to be a Kennedy in that time. I think it's harder to be a Cayce in that time. But they make such a big impact, you know, because it's just unnecessary they're making an imprint. They're coming in at a right time and they're doing big things. And even if they burn out quick or whatever, it's still there. There's still references. How many times do you hear people try to steal the Kennedy name or the Cayce name? You know, people sense that there's something there. They remember who these people were and what they're connected to. And they try to reanimate them into certain things to make you trust you.
Right.
So there's a lot of weird magical things done with people like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not hurting them, you know. It's, you know, once they're gone, it's like, let's use them still. You know, it's not pleasant.
This is a ritual aspect that you're getting at here, and we have to get our hands on it to understand exactly how these things work, so that, you know, when they go down and when these deep events happen, we understand there's a counterpart in the background that has to do with a kind of occult reality. And it's what Rudolf Steiner called the brotherhoods and the mystery schools of the left hand. And they use the same abilities, but for very different ends. And it's something that I think we need to get a handle on. Miss Olivia.
Well, oversee, it's not a question, but it's intriguing. Says psychic infiltration through alcohol and money. And I thought Gigi might want to comment on that because, you know, Hemingway being a very well-known drunk and how that could have impacted him being sort of demonically possessed on some level, even, you know, with a suicide in the family, this legacy of alcoholism, and sort of the contracts around money and fame also, and how that can open you up to dark influences.
Yeah, it can. I mean, you don't ever really want to be outside of yourself for too long. You know, with drinking, with, you know, with drugs, you really don't want to have this habit of being outside of yourself for long periods of time and avoiding, because that's when something's going to fill that, something's going to come in. And if you're doing that, whatever you're doing for a negative reason, that's going to be the frequency in which it comes in. And so you have to be very present and very conscious. Because that can definitely happen. And a lot of people can be a little bit interested in magic and the occult, and they can go into some darker things too, not believing in it, not real, I don't believe in it, whatever. And then they're like, oh, it's real.
Right.
So there's a lot of different ways that these things that, you know, you can get attachments and things like that.
No question. And alcohol is certainly one of those avenues for sure. You know, it's fascinating when we look at these people and the extraordinary timing that they have. I think this is something that you were bringing out there in your response, which is when you think of this period of Camelot, of Kennedy, that is the Camelot period. It is, you know, the moon landing is going to happen. He's launching people into the moon. He's setting the tone on civil rights. These figures come in. You can look at people who held the office much longer and say, like, well, you know, Obama held the office for 8 years and like was basically a clerk for the bankers. So it's not timing, it's what you do with the time that you have there.
How you make people feel.
Yes.
It's how you make people feel. And it's a way that you are. And you can't fake it. You can't.
Right.
And people know.
Well, isn't it interesting that that wave of leaders that we had in the 60s, who really seemed to be leading us to a much better place, JFK, RFK, and MLK, for example, um, all the victims of violent assassination, where other people like LBJ, Nixon, Nelson Rockefeller, no problem.
But also, like, it's not about any of these individuals that we're talking about being associated with Camelot being perfect. It's
Right.
not about perfection. We're not saying that the Kennedys were perfect or Cayce or anyone was perfect. They make mistakes. You know, we're human, but it's where their heart is, right?
Right, right, absolutely. It's a great point, and of course, Gigi has a lot of heart, as we know, going into this.
Try.
I want to remind everyone that you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is really, we're on this breakthrough stretch of episodes here, and it's only going to get deeper. And the deeper I get into it, you know, of course, in doing the X series, I expect a lot of deep things to come out and remarkable things to be brought forward. However, even I'm surprised at the level historically that this is leading us into. And a lot of that has to do with the partnership of working with Gigi, because when we look at things and we're looking at it from just a deep state angle, we get a lot of knowledge. But if we can pursue the mystery school avenue and then understand groups that are going to come into this, when I mentioned like the Orphic Circle and the information that Emma Britton gave us around that, that forms a real foundation for the series. We're talking about psychic investigation there. And if you don't have that element working for you, if you aren't incorporating that in, you're getting maybe half the picture. So applying that in, that combination of the deep research with the intuitive insight is, I think, what's taking things higher and higher. With that, I'm going to take a look here at a few pictures that'll give us some impression of Kennedy and Hemingway and how that comes together, because I'm going to connect those dots solidly so there is no question. First of all, here's a young Kennedy getting out of Harvard and going into the Navy, where he will serve during World War II, and his boat will get split, and he will end up saving the men on that boat and helping them survive on an island and smuggle a coconut out with a secret message. His famous coconut, which he did keep on his desk in the White House. There's a very interesting crisscross here with the time that Ernest Hemingway was in France. And Ernest Hemingway, writing about the lost generation and hanging out with Picasso and hanging out with Cezanne and all of these incredible, and James Joyce, this incredible group. And, you know, Gigi, you showed me that fascinating documentary you found on Paris in the 1920s. And it was really exceptional to get that feeling of what it meant to have those creative Americans in there in a place where they could be set free and they weren't censored. And it's a very small period in history, but Hemingway was right in the middle of it.
Oh, he was in the middle, and they were just having a great time. They were just creating art and just drinking wine. And the documentary was shown to me by Spirit. They're like, send this to you, and
Wow.
so I did.
Yes.
They just kind of, same way that I found Hiram, kind of the same thing. Sometimes they'll do that. Well, they'll just be like, type this in, send this, and so that was one of those things. And in that, and yeah, lots kind of came in there with Gertrude Stein. We could get into that little piece.
Yes. Yes. Actually, I'm going to show a picture of Gertrude Stein. You can narrate a little bit of what you found here. I will say this with Gertrude, which is, remember that she was the understudy to William James, and that William James founded the Psychic Society, and that William James wrote the incredible breakthrough book, which I always keep close by, which is The Varieties of Religious Experience, because it incorporates psychology with spiritual and mystical beliefs, which is absolutely crucial. But Stein was a very unusual figure. She dominated the scene there on the literary side in France, and she hosted the top talent there. And she had a very huge influence on Hemingway and a close friendship with a young John F. Kennedy.
Yeah, she did. She was what I got psychically from her. She's such a fascinating woman. Like really, she kind of is a no, I won't actually go that far, but she I really got the impression that there was kind of a lot of experimental mysticism going on.
Yes.
And so they didn't necessarily cover it closely, but you could tell by some of the wording that was used that they were basically all experimenting with mysticism together, different psychic states, maybe rituals, things like that. But they were experimenting with maybe loss of, like they were, they were playing around in mysticism. Which led me to a certain location in Paris, which we can get into at another time or whatever. But
No, I've got the picture here. I'm right with you.
okay,
Absolutely. Here, I'll show the picture.
yeah, you show.
This is it. This is called Le Sphinx.
Le Sphinx.
And it's a very interesting club where they would get together and do what, Gigi?
Well, they would get together and they would do rituals and they would play with mysticism and they would use some of the girls there. It kind of was a brothel, but it's not like a brothel because it's Paris, right? It's like
Yes.
kind of brothel. No, just kidding. But you have to remember, though, that with mysticism, there is a lane of mysticism that really honored sacred sex and the energy of women in kind of that way. And I kind of got that as well.
The sex magic goes both ways. Absolutely.
Right. And so it was very sacred for a lot of practices as well. I think there was a time where that was, we don't get that now. But
yeah, no, absolutely not.
There.
Yeah.
It was there.
The culture's too immature to handle it. But
right, exactly.
All those things, the Eastern traditions around sex, absolutely.
Yeah, and so it seems like, oh, weird, why are you doing it in a brothel? But like, if you really understand the mysteries, it's like, oh, that's why they would maybe have that there. And of course, it was on top of the entrance to the catacombs, and I believe the Masonic, I think it was a cemetery.
Graveyard, absolutely.
Graveyard.
Yeah. So that's underneath there. Underneath the Strange Club is a Mason cemetery. And we know when you get into that Masonic imagery, especially when you're in France, you're in the center. Blavatsky and Steiner both pointed out, France, you're right in the hardcore center of the mystery schools.
Yes, I didn't realize that, but
that's really, that's the tradition there.
Oh, well, yeah, and they were into that. And there's a lot of different things with Le Sphinx that was going on. But I got visions. The specific visions that I got were like, honestly, I felt like they were playing psychic games and they were experimenting and they were kind of doing Orphic circle things. And Gertrude was leading it. That was my impression, is she was getting people together and she was kind of leading it and she was connected with the people there. And the people that founded the Sphinx, I think, funded it, spent a lot of time in Egypt too. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is going to be, it makes for a very interesting investigation on its own, exactly the nature of it. But they did call it like seances and, this whole kind of thing. When you think about the Orphic Circle, also, let's remember this. Literary figures. What did Emma Britton tell us? Charles Dickens was there. Bulwer Lytton, who wrote, all of these fantastic, The Coming Race and the real sci-fi of the 1800s. Those were the figures that were there, along with prime ministers and all the rest. So when we see this group of literary figures coalescing and artists like Hemingway and all the rest of it, here's another version of that Orphic Circle there, right there in Paris, which is probably older than the ones that they had in London.
Yeah, and who's exactly, and Hemingway, he's in his 20s, I believe, in Paris.
Right.
And who's to say that it wasn't Gertrude Stein and that whole circle that really made him aware in a deep way of his own spirituality and maybe of who he was in past lives and maybe even kind of got him even closer interested into Atlantis.
Yes, absolutely. We have a 20-year-old Jack Kennedy in the late 30s, absolutely obsessed with Gertrude Stein and learning from her and spending time with her and collecting artifacts and her autograph and all these other things. So we can see that connection there early on. Kennedy obsessed with the lost generation and Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein coming out of William James being a Harvard professor on one side and founding the Psychic Society on the other. That's the balance that was there. That's the key that gets removed as we go. Just like when we get into Freud, we lose a lot of the other stuff on the psychology side. It's this boxed in version. It's the kind of scientific materialism creeping in through psychology there. And so we're losing that whole psychic side.
Yes.
Period. Absolutely. Quite fascinating. Miss Olivia, while I change this over to my less Hemingway stuff, how are your questions going?
Good. I have to say, we are experiencing tremendous trolls tonight, which we have not in a while.
Yeah.
So that being said, Gigi, you want to take a question?
Go for it.
Well, this comes up all the time, and I know it's a little off topic, but Brent Burnside wanted to know, do you have any connection with the Vril?
Everyone always goes for this with you, Gigi.
People, do you know how often I get that question? People always want to know if I'm like Maria Orsic reincarnated. And I don't have any genetic connection that I know to the Vril.
Have you spent much time trying to tap into them and understand them?
I have not. I have not. I do know that they contacted Aldebaran, which hasn't been somewhere that I've personally connected with. So their source wouldn't be my source. That I have a different kind of cosmic lineage there, but people do tend to associate that with me. But I don't know.
I literally think it's a visual thing.
Yeah, because
I mean, they're psychics and they're, they have striking visually. I think that's the whole Maria Orsic.
they had a lot longer hair than I did.
Right, exactly. You have to grow it longer and then they'll really.
I'm growing it just to do that, just to impersonate in Las Vegas. Like, it's gonna come out like Vril.
Vril, the showgirl movie. Yeah.
Vril, yeah, that's my future.
Fantastic. I want to remind everyone that you're watching Dark Journalists. We're going deep here on the interplay between Ernest Hemingway and Bimini, the Atlantis Rising predictions of Edgar Cayce, Grace Hemingway's connection to Edgar Cayce, and the actual ruins. And we're getting a feel for the family and the past of Ernest Hemingway. And now we have Jack Kennedy coming into this picture. One of the things I want to mention before I didn't put this across is there is something on the record that Gertrude Stein has said regarding Hemingway that I think is important. One, she said his conversation would always come around to the fifth dimension of time, fifth dimensional time, and how the ancients knew about it and we don't. That's kind of an interesting thing for a young writer in Paris to be thinking about.
That's deep. That's deep.
Yes.
If you're acknowledging the fifth dimension and you're thinking time is different. AKA, how can I use that? So.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what's interesting. And this is what I find remarkable when we look at Hemingway. We're getting, hang on just a second. I'm actually experiencing feedback. Is that your mic, Miss Olivia?
I don't think it's mine.
Okay, no, it's good. Actually, when you talk, I think it just appears.
Okay.
There's something called Hemingway Achieves the Fifth Dimension, which is an interesting article by Frederick Carpenter. And he takes on this question of, did, in fact, Hemingway go after this dimensional question? So he says, quote, in Green Hills of Africa, Ernest Hemingway prophesied the kind of writing that can be done. This is his quote. Kind of writing that can be done. How far prose can be carried if anyone is serious enough and has luck. There is a fourth and fifth dimension that can be gotten. Fourth and fifth dimension. Here it is, the confirmation for what Gertrude Stein was saying. He's saying it. Later, they ask, what was going on here? And they go through it and they say, was he describing, was he interested in dimensions? And so on. And he described the fifth dimension as a mystical figure of speech. Mystical figure of speech. So obviously, I think what we're getting from Hemingway is this undertow, again, of this esoteric knowledge, this interest over and over again coming up. What I find interesting is, of course, we've dealt so much with stealth archives and we've dealt so much with the time capsule aspect. There was a story in an English newspaper, and just for the kind of synchronicities that we have that happened on this show at the X Steganography, inside that show, inside that article was Mariel Hemingway, and she was going to the ranch in Cuba and revisiting it so many years later, and she was walking around with this crew from the Today Show. And what happened was, I'm going to show this picture. She stepped up to a bookshelf here, and right there we can see it says, it's from July 1960, and it says, "Can anyone stop Kennedy?" And that's JFK there. And oddly enough, the wording that they used in the article right here, as you can see it, it says time capsule. So there we have time capsule, Hemingway, and JFK in that one picture, it's snapshot. But interesting, just that visual reminder again that he's got this "Can anyone stop Kennedy" thing there in his ranch in Cuba. Now, Hemingway, interestingly enough, when we look at him through the lens of having this back channel communication with JFK on one hand and having this background with Cayce doing readings for him and his mother, we have to say we're looking at somebody who is deep on history on one side and on the esoteric on the other. That explains his activities in Cuba a hell of a lot better, and it explains this whole thing about that capsule and about the vault there that got taken out of Cuba. Now, I'm going to briefly reiterate what I said last Friday about this so that everyone's on the same page. There are documents that we brought forward and that we have here, and I'll show, that demonstrate clearly that Mary Hemingway with JFK put together a plan to get that vault out of the house in Cuba and bring it back, smuggle it back into the US, and eventually to find those contents at the JFK library. Although what really happened and what the contents were is a total mystery. And I mean a complete mystery. Now, Mary Hemingway, his widow, and his brother, Les, both felt that the CIA had assassinated Hemingway. Hemingway felt that he was under siege by the CIA, which is why this next piece of information that we come up with relating to Ed Lansdale and the JFK assassination and what they were trying to do in relation to the vault in Cuba is so crucial. Now, I will say this, so we understand the outcome before it happens. Kennedy arranges it so that she can go there, and when she goes there, she meets with Castro. And she gives Castro a message from Kennedy. She gets the vault, and then she they have to make a deal basically where she's going to donate the property to the public of Cuba, which was what she thinks she does. But they tell her, no, you didn't do it to the public of Cuba. You did it to us as a private interest. You gave it to the state so that they controlled it. Quite important, I think, as the story goes around later. But anyway, let's kind of summarize this point. Mary Hemingway goes to Cuba after Ernest Hemingway's assassination or suicide, however you want to view it. She goes there, she meets with Castro, he gives her the contents of the vault. The Kennedy administration smuggles it out on a shrimp boat. It comes back here. Jackie Kennedy takes care after the Kennedy assassination to get the contents of the capsule and to keep it with the JFK library. That's one. That's a Stealth Archive 1. Here's Stealth Archive 2. Later, aides to Mary Hemingway will say, oh no, she didn't give all the material to Jackie Kennedy. She kept it in a vault in New York City. So this material relating to what they were hiding there, in my opinion, obviously related to what we'll call this Atlantis Rising situation. And I think that's really where we are as we move into this next segment here.
Yeah, yeah. The time capsule and everything is just, I would love to see what was in there. I'd love to know.
This is where we're going to go. So let's take a look at a couple of things. Ernest, when he came back to America from Cuba, he was disturbed about what was going on. He was disturbed about, he felt that he'd been hounded by the FBI since the 30s and by the CIA since the 40s. And he was very disturbed about the entire situation. And JFK at this point, looking down at the situation of Cuba and getting that information back, took a big risk because after the revolution, Cuba was the ultimate hot potato and could have sank his ratings there. So what happens is that Hemingway dies. He's suicided, or as we said, he commits suicide. And here's the statement now from Kennedy about it. And I think there's some very telling things that he says in here. Quote, John Kennedy, few Americans have had a greater impact on the emotions and attitudes of the American people than Ernest Hemingway. From his first emergence as one of the bright literary stars in Paris during the 20s, as a chronicler of the lost generation, which he was to immortalize, he almost single-handedly transformed the literature and the ways of thought of men and women in every country of the world. When he began to write, the American artist had to look for a home on the left bank of Paris. Today, the United States is one of the great centers of art. Although his journeys throughout the world to France, to Spain, and even to Africa made him one of the great citizens of the world, he ended life as he began it, in the heartland of America, in which he brought renown and from which he drew his art. Pretty heartfelt there for someone that historians would say had no relationship, although we're demonstrating they had letters and meetings. I'd say there's a kind of a real emotional touch to that letter. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot in that letter. And I think at the end, you can really tell that JFK is trying to accent that he's an American. Like, yes, Hemingway may have traveled, he may have lived in Paris, he may have gone to Africa, but he was an American. Right. And I think that that's significant because at that time, obviously, it was really contentious with Cuba. And he gave his award to Cuba. There's pictures of him with Castro. But here you have Kennedy, someone who didn't know Hemingway, apparently, allegedly didn't know Hemingway, saying, but he was an American. So I feel like it's almost like that's what he was trying to like leave in the minds of people who were listening.
This was a true blue American, yes.
Yeah, he's not, yeah.
Absolutely.
In case he was criticized or something and someone tried to make him look bad about being Cuban or about being whatever, it's like he was trying to, you know, put the right stamp on it. That's kind of what I got from it.
Absolutely. He had invited Hemingway to the inauguration and to make a statement there. Hemingway initially agreed and then had to bow out because of a health issue, supposedly. It's very odd. Also, it could have been politically embarrassing. I think it's possible. I have letters between JFK and Hemingway that I'm going to get into as well. So we will put to rest the idea that there was no contact there. I'm also going to reveal that Bill Walton was the go-between between Hemingway and JFK. And Bill Walton was a correspondent for Time Life. He went through World War II, through the 60s, Vietnam. He's very well known. And he was used by Kennedy as a back channel. As a matter of fact, after the Kennedy assassination took place, Robert Kennedy used him directly as a back channel to the Soviet Union, where Bobby Kennedy's message was, we understand the Russians were not involved in the assassination of my brother. We know it was a conspiracy in-house, basically. It was a domestic conspiracy here inside, an inside job. So they were on the same page, so that he, basically Kennedy was taking what he had left of the government saying, we're not going to let them use it as an excuse to get into a nuclear exchange with you guys. We know better. But he used Walton for that. Walton tells a very interesting story, Gigi, speaking of psychic powers, which is he's driving along there during the Spanish Civil War with Hemingway, and Hemingway stops the car, grabs him, and rolls him down a hill, and practically beats him up, rolling him down the hill. and really viciously. And Walton's like, "What are you doing, you madman? You know, all the stories about you are true," and all the rest. And then a shell comes in and destroys the Jeep they were driving in. So he saved his life there. Prescient, some prescient ability there. No question.
Oh, yeah.
More links in that psychic chain around the Hemingways. Okay, we'll keep going. I want us to take in the significance of this document here, and I'm going to go through the document. This is a document that was declassified that belonged to the Kennedy White House, and is the memo of Ed Lansdale, who's the Major General that I described earlier, who's always involved in these coups d'etats and works closely with the CIA, is technically under the umbrella of the Air Force. Famously, there's a book called Breakaway. It's the Breakaway Civilizations book. Actually, I have it close by, and I'll dig the title out. It's that one over there on top of the Ultimate Frontier. Actually, can you give me that? Yeah, fantastic. Okay. I want to make sure everyone has the title for this.
Oh, this one?
Yes, fabulous. Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations, Secret Space Programs, Celestial Psyops, and Hidden Conflicts. This is Joseph Farrell's book that has a fantastic overview on Ed Lansdale and the job, the kind of deep state work that Ed Lansdale did. For example, after we won the war in Japan, Ed Lansdale's job was to take the driver of the emperor and to torture him in order to find out where the hidden Japanese gold was, and then to use that gold as a secret system of finance, which became this secret system that the CIA funneled so many black budget programs through. Very well documented, and Lansdale showing up over and over again in these different situations when somebody is overthrown, or like I said, in Suharto in Indonesia. Very interesting book by Joseph Farrell. One of the things I want to point out about Lansdale, the ultimate puppet here, that's Lansdale. This is Allen Dulles, who Kennedy would fire as the CIA director because Dulles was trying to do a number of illegal things, including get us involved in a war with Cuba. And during that whole Bay of Pigs experience, Kennedy had a conversation with Dulles where he said, as it turns out, if this was the UK, I'd have to go, but because it's America, you have to go. The kind of tense relationship with the head of the CIA that Kennedy had is well documented. I think any historian would go along. They may not agree with me that the CIA assassinated Kennedy, but this tense relationship comes down through memos and Kennedy's conversation with Arthur Schlesinger, saying that he will, in fact, destroy the CIA, scatter it to the breeze into 1,000 pieces. The CIA understood that, and they were prepared to take him on, basically, because they felt that they ran the world, and they had really represented interests that had been running America for many years before this kid came along. But I think we have to understand that connection with Lansdale and Dulles in order to understand his actions later. Lansdale is the ultimate covert black budget operator and black ops guy. So one of the interesting things is Fletcher Prouty was the intermediary between the CIA and the Pentagon for the Joint Chiefs. It's an incredibly high position. And he worked with Lansdale, who was his immediate superior. Lansdale, he worked with for over, since the 40s, basically. So something like 15 some odd years. And Lansdale tells him, you're going to the South Pole shortly before the JFK assassination. And he says, oh, really? Something important going on? He says, yeah, you have to take these dignitaries from the South Pole to America. And, you're going to be up there for a couple of months. It's a good trip. Just make sure that you're there and you check out the situation. When he gets up there, he finds out there's a very low-level dignitary, and he doesn't understand why he's been appointed to this position, but he starts to get suspicious because one of his jobs, had he remained in D.C. at this point, would be to set up the security around the president. That was the first problem with the Lansdale issue for him. Later, during the assassination, shortly afterwards, police grabbed these men who were behind the building, the Texas School Book Depository, and they were in a railway car and suspiciously just sitting there. And when they grabbed them, they realized they weren't hobos. They were too well dressed, etc. And so they marched them very bizarrely through Dealey Plaza. And there's a picture here that an AP reporter took just accidentally capturing this moment. It's quite remarkable. These are the men. These are the police who are escorting them. And there's a great distance, as we can see, between all of these people. You know, if you kind of get these guys into jail, it seems like you're just kind of giving them this incredible leeway. This gentleman here, who was walking by the tramps, is the individual that Prouty identified as his boss for 15 years, Ed Lansdale, walking by the people who were here, sort of giving communication or support, something behind that building. And what happened was, when Prouty saw this photo, he became so curious about it that he did something. He sent the photo without saying what he was thinking to all of his former associates there in that Pentagon circle. And he said, here, what do you think of this picture? And they all wrote back, what was Ed Lansdale doing in Dealey Plaza? Because they all recognized him. Now, it's true, when you look at the picture, there are angles to it that you might think, well, this is a guy walking by. But there's something about the people who had worked with him, who understood who he was and what he did, that they could recognize him. And this picture is somewhat immortalized. It's funny because that whole fence thing is still there now when you go to Texas. So quite fascinating. So Lansdale, being involved in the JFK assassination, resigning from the Air Force shortly before it took place, and being the key man that had sent Prouty and the security forces off to the South Pole. I mean, that's as far away as you're going to get. So we have to kind of get a handle on who this person was there. I think we have kind of an idea of the depth of a black operator like that. So now he will, in this next document, refer directly to the Hemingway ranch in Cuba in the following document, speaking about a conversation regarding Mary Hemingway and all the rest of it. Now, of course, being a CIA operative in the Air Force, he understands how to couch his language, but nonetheless, we're going to catch interesting glimpses from what he says. So in this top secret sensitive memo that was declassified, he said, the president, JFK, said bluntly, we were not discussing the use of U.S. military force. These guys are furious because they want to use force against Cuba. General Lemnitzer might find the U.S. so engaged in Berlin or elsewhere that he couldn't use the contemplated 4 divisions, but they were attempting to assign for Cuba. So we cannot say that we are able now to make a decision on the use of U.S. military force. So Kennedy's basically saying, you don't have enough men. You know, if you go into Cuba and they move to Berlin, it's going to be a problem. So we're not going to go that way. So these people are very upset about his stance. And this is part of the roots of the assassination plan. The president then commented that he hoped something could be done about the press, that the newspapers would start conjecturing on operations just as they did in April '61. Now, this is referring to the Bay of Pigs disaster that had where Dulles had dragged the Kennedy administration through this disastrous process of trying to invade Cuba, and Kennedy wouldn't provide the support, and the op failed. Now, there's many things that go on here in this memo, so I'm going to move down a little bit. Kennedy had said that we could help the people of Cuba regain their freedom, and that the people inside would get some hope. You can see where Kennedy is coming from. He's thinking of the people there. He's not worried about blowing the government away. I think that's important. This spiritual factor of having hope of something better than what they are now saddled with is vitally important at this time. The president then asked about immigration. Wouldn't it be better to shut our doors to the people trying to get out so that they would be forced to stay and take action against the regime? I pointed out, this is Lansdale talking, I pointed out that we still were giving them only 2 choices, either to escape to the U.S. in freedom or to stay and be slaves. Once we are committed to helping them stage a revolt, providing arms, and are willing to go all the way in being sure that they win, then we might consider closing our doors. You can see how Lansdale thinks. He's saying, you know, we'll provide the arms, you'll overtake the government, but we'll kind of do it for you. And this is what he's famous for. He's famous for overthrowing governments. And of course, when he participates in the JFK assassination, he's taking those rules that he learned overseas and bringing them back to the US. The Attorney General, RFK, then mentioned Mary Hemingway. This is Hemingway's wife, who they had worked it out to get this capsule out. I believe what is coming up here is the reference to the capsule and its importance. And I think that this is basically Lansdale's signaling of what it was about. Because historians like Arthur Schlesinger, who looked at this document, said that he could not tell what Lansdale was referring to. This is quite significant because he was very familiar with all the Kennedy operations. So again, RFK then mentioned Mary Hemingway, commenting on reports that Castro was drinking heavily in disgruntlement over the way things were going. The opportunities offered by the shrine to Hemingway, it's a very odd statement. The shrine to Hemingway is referring to the ranch that he was forced to leave that had the vault inside of it. That's the shrine. I commented that this was a conversation Ed Murrow had had with Mary Hemingway, that we had similar reports from other sources, and that this was worth assessing firmly and pursuing vigorously. This was worth. It doesn't say what it is, but it's worth pursuing vigorously. If there are grounds for action, CIA had some invaluable assets which might well be committed to such an effort. That's Lansdale. Again, if there are grounds for action, mentioning it right after Hemingway's ranch. If there are grounds for action, CIA had some invaluable assets which might well be committed to such an effort. There are people in Cuba that Hemingway, that the CIA could use there relating to this op around the Hemingway ranch. So historians don't know what he's referring to. Well, now that we're thinking about the vault, we're starting to get a picture of what this is about. So again, if there are grounds for action, CIA had some invaluable assets which might well be committed for such an effort. McCone, he's the CIA director now, replacing Dulles, who was Lansdale's old boss. So basically, Lansdale hates McCone or dislikes him. McCone asked if his personal operational people were aware of this. This is the CIA director asking an Air Force Major General if his operational people were aware of this. So the CIA director that they put in there doesn't know. This guy knows. This guy has control of the intelligence apparatus, obviously. For such an effort, again, what is the effort? Nobody knows. But it happens at the Hemingway ranch. If there are grounds for action, CIA had some invaluable assets that might well be committed for such an effort. McCone asked if his operational people were aware of this. I told him that we had discussed this, that they had agreed the subject was worth vigorous development. What subject? No one knows. Historians don't know. What's he talking about? They had agreed the subject was worth vigorous development at the Hemingway ranch. And they were in agreement that the matter was so delicate and sensitive that it shouldn't be surfaced to the special group until we were ready to go, and then not in detail. The op, in my opinion, relates to the CIA attempting to grab the vault. This was the first course of action that apparently was rejected by the Kennedy administration, who somehow was able to send Mary Hemingway there with a note, who met Castro at Hemingway's ranch and got the vault and smuggled the information back, the contents of the vault back to America on a shrimp boat. One other point here about Lansdale. What he says, I think, is guys like this don't commit themselves in writing to documents like this. So this is what's so important. I told him that we had discussed this, that they had agreed the subject was worth vigorous development, and that we were in agreement that the matter was so delicate and sensitive that it shouldn't be surfaced to the special group until we were ready to go, and then not in detail. It's so sensitive and delicate. That vault in Hemingway's ranch was that sensitive and delicate, that the top man who's giving the CIA directions about his operational personnel, since he doesn't know, he's giving him those instructions saying that this is so sensitive. He's telling him, the head of the CIA, that this is so sensitive. What could it be? Historians don't know. Basically, now we just told you. The only thing it could be is the vault, because it's at the ranch. What else could it be? Very interesting. Gigi turning the tides of history there.
Yep, turning them over. That was very. No, it was very secret.
Yeah.
I really got the impression that it was the vault.
Okay.
But it was also the land, and that the land was also significant too. And it could be because of tunnels or something that was going on there, but it was kind of like the whole estate. It was what he had. It was, he chose where he was living for a reason.
Yes.
It's all of that.
Gigi, while you're on the beam about the ranch and about Hemingway there, that vault, the dot I want to connect tonight, I think the vault connects directly to Paul Zalitsky's finding of the Cuban Atlantis city underwater, reported in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and in her own work. She, from Poland, recruited by the Soviet Union, by the KGB, as an oceanographer and an engineer, obviously a highly specialized, highly qualified person, very interesting biography, very interesting woman, and interesting role in history, but nonetheless, an unusual step. She goes to Cuba, she defects to Canada after some years there. She's there originally deployed as part of this Soviet team in Cuba, 1968. 68, of course, is when the Bimini Wall rose, and they took pictures of it, and Kennedy and Cayce said, well, expect it in 68 or 69, and it rose. Some of the images that she took of these cities and pointed out in her own, this is her own presentation of where those ruins are. Here are the ruins, and here's where they are, according to her. Now, she revealed it in 2001. There are stories still to this day about Hemingway and the farmhouse mystery and the vault and all the rest of it, but it's lost to history. Can we connect this Cuban city and the materials that Hemingway had in the vault? What do you think?
Yeah, I think you absolutely can. I think you can connect it with, I think he was onto that. And I think he had specific, probably items. And I think he also probably found some things in Cuba too, as well. But yeah, I think you can connect it. I think he had positioned himself pretty much like in the center, in between like Bimini on one side, and then he's got the Yucatan on the other. He's got another city that just nobody talks about. He had positioned himself as though he was really interested in Atlantis, like the perfect position.
Absolutely. Something quite remarkable, which, as you know, whenever you and I do a show together, strange things come out of the blue and make themselves known. This one had to do with Andrew Collins' work, and Andrew Collins is someone who's been out there for quite some time. Here's his book, Gateway to Atlantis, and he's a fantastic researcher of ancient ruins, and his books are always quite interesting. He did a huge section on Cuba in his book, Gateway to Atlantis. This is from 2003. They briefly mentioned the story with Paul Zalitsky because it's just coming to the surface there. But one of the things that I found absolutely fascinating is that this reference that comes up mentions Les Hemingway and gives him the role of discovering the Cuban city originally. And here we go. J. Manson Valentine, who found the Bimini Road in the same year that Cayce predicted it would rise, 1968, he's citing him here, and he says, Valentine correctly surmised that the relationship between the two land masses was originally a geological one, and that they previously had been joined together like Siamese twins back to back before being split apart by rift faulting in some past geological age, perhaps as early as the Tertiary. And he's talking about the Great Bahama Bank and Cuba. So he's saying, well, these were connected as one landmass. She will go on, Zalitsky, to say that Yucatan and Cuba were connected. Valentine, more pertinently, it has long been considered that the shallow waters north of Cuba might hold important clues concerning the Great Bahama Bank's strange antediluvian world as early as the 1950s. Light aircraft pilots reported seeing what they described as underwater stonework that was well within Cuban waters. Similar sightings north of Cuba of an alleged submerged building complex covering some 10 acres might even have convinced the Cuban government that a verifiable city awaited discovery in its vigorously defended waters. This is what opened them up. This is what Zalitsky is doing in Cuba, in my opinion. There are, for instance, unconfirmed reports that this building complex was explored with the assistance of Soviet submarines. Of course, that's where they got the high technology to check it out back then. As unlikely as this story might seem, it is a fact that following the publication of Russian academic Nikolai Zerov's authoritative work Atlantis Atlantology, Basic Problems, in 1970, the Soviet Union embraced his findings and actively sought evidence for the existence of Atlantis in different parts of the Atlantic Ocean. Among those who felt they had glimpsed remains of a lost citadel in Cuban waters was Lester Hemingway, brother of the writer Ernest Hemingway. During a flight into the country, Lester noticed beyond its northern coast an expanse of stone ruins. Several acres in area, apparently white, as if they were marble. The exact location of these underwater features remains unclear. He didn't go on the record, but we know what he did shortly afterwards. He founded New Atlantis. There he is on top. A couple of quick images here. Oh, by the way, that's Margot Hemingway in the ranch, going back and finding a picture of her parents. Kennedy with Hemingway's widow working out how to get the capsule out of Cuba. Undeniable. One last thing on this. The exact location of these underwater features remains unclear. This is an enormous three-side sea shelf with over 100 kilometers in length and width, situated approximately 70 kilometers north of Cuba. There's a lot of things actually in this book that I recommend for looking into this, but I think we have their confirmation. Lester, seen here, talking about an Atlantean healing well on Bimini Island and leading the documentary producers to the location and showing himself and his daughter Hillary bathing in it. He will die 2 years after this in a similar suicide function that Ernest Hemingway was suicided. Apparently getting too close to this Atlantis rising wave. So here we have the stamp actually of New Atlantis. I want to show that too. This is the New Atlantis stamp that they were going to use. 6 cents. And one of the remarkable things that he did was he got all these people to kind of sign up to this idea of a new Atlantis, this new utopia, and he was putting together a constitution for it. And what happened ultimately was that the government said, if you do this, we'll view you as a hostile power down there and you're not going to last very long. But he hung out anyway, and then unfortunately a hurricane ruined a lot of the material, the construction he had down there. So Hemingway's suicide, his brother's suicide, 1980, Margot's suicide in 1996, holding those family secrets in a sense, even things she may not have known. This pattern, again, is related to the Atlantean finds.
It is.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And there we are deep into it. Zalitsky comes up very interestingly in the grand scheme of things. I want to point out something, which is her book. And it's called The Sea is Only Knee Deep, Volume 1. And that's her with her dad. And it's a remarkable story, nonetheless. There's no mention in these volumes of her Cuban discovery. It tells me that she's under a real lock, and that the work she did for Cuba is not something that she's able to discuss with us now. The Cuban finds are in this weird limbo, very much like the Hall of Records under the Sphinx was after the dating was questioned by Robert Schoch. This material, again, forms a stealth archive where we know it's there. We've seen the pictures, but we can't get our hands on it. So we're in the stealth archive era here, Gigi.
We are. I also I was engrossed.
Yes.
And I just realized, I just got that there were things about Kennedy. There were things about Kennedy in the vault.
Oh, yes.
There were things about, I didn't pick it up the first time because my focus was wrong.
Right.
I was thinking about something else, but there were things about Kennedy in his vault.
Well, this is fascinating. We're going to follow up on that, obviously. And it does make sense because Kennedy's so deeply involved at that point. And they basically have the Cuban Missile Crisis, risks World War III. He makes sure they don't invade Cuba. But you have to wonder, beyond the regular geopolitics, why are the Russians putting nukes into Cuba?
It's all fun. Yeah.
I mean, they really feel like, they know. They've got Paula Zalitsky sent down there.
They're protecting something, and they're sending a message, and they're, yeah.
Interestingly enough, I think the blackout, the media blackout around the Cuban finds is absolutely fascinating because they had to cover it initially in 2001. When she came forward, she was a respected oceanographer, and she still is, and an engineer. So it wasn't somebody you could blow off. She was working with a legitimate company, ADC, and she had the graphics. I have many more, The fact is, that city is there, and it represents what Cayce was talking about with Atlantis. Interestingly enough, one of the things that Les Hemingway was trying to do, which is going to form the basis of the follow-up episode that you and I are going to do tomorrow night at 6 p.m., is Les was trying to buy lots in the Atlantic Ocean for when Atlantis rose, so that he would own that land when it came up. And we're finding out a lot of celebrities and a lot of other people were engaged in this process also. Where that process leads us, I think, is very fascinating. I want to remind everyone that you're watching Dark Journalist, and I want to tell everyone to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. That's the way that we keep in touch, given all the things that are happening on social media and the SmackDown, especially with episodes like this. You're not going to find this material anywhere else, and it gets more and more tricky, let's say, on the social media side. But if you're on the newsletter, that's our little link back and forth with each other. And basically, you just get an email once a week letting you know what shows are coming up and what live events will be coming up for 2019. We're here with Gigi Young. Go to gigiyoung.com. You're going to want to also find out about Gigi Young's YouTube channel. Remarkable work, as I've said before many times. There's no better friend and ally to the X series than Gigi Young. And we've done a lot of work together behind the scenes.
Yep.
And I mean, there's so many interesting threads out of that work that we're doing something great here. Now, Miss Olivia, you are up.
Okay, there's tons of questions. I have not been able to follow your conversation too much because there have been so many trolls. And I'm here by
Wow.
myself. Carly had to bail. So,
Okay.
Grandma
You're doing a great job.
Thank you. Grandma Tippy Toes says, what happened to the vault? Where is it now? Or more importantly, where are the contents?
That's the $64,000 question. Here's what we know for sure. Mary Hemingway stated that she gave the contents to Jackie Kennedy and that Jackie Kennedy incorporated them into the new, at the time, Kennedy Library and Museum. We do know there's a Hemingway exhibit going on now with all of this material of Ernest Hemingway. That's one story. Here's the other side of the story. Mary Hemingway's aides in the 80s said, oh no, she didn't give that material. She kept most of it in a vault in New York City. Now, let's think about the vault itself for a minute and this unusual play that Ed Lansdale gets involved in and that national security meetings are held over. What could be in Hemingway's vault that would be that explosive that basically the CIA director is saying it's too sensitive? They know something about that vault. And maybe Kennedy knows a lot more about it because of his back channel, Bill Walton, to Hemingway. There's something about the vault itself that we have to say Hemingway's work there, staying in Bimini, his brother Les knowing about the Cuban city. They're scanning around. They're probably getting the information on the underground city of Atlantis Rising, that Hemingway's mother introduced the concept to him through her friendship with Edgar Cayce, Cayce's son visiting Hemingway's mother, observing her art, and so on. Hemingway being this kind of intuitive psychic individual, talking early on with people like Gertrude Stein about fifth dimensional time. I think these facts come together. They form a portrait. So the thing is, I don't have direct knowledge of what happened to the vault, but I think we can take a pretty good guess at the official story that it just wound up at the Kennedy Library. It doesn't cover it.
It doesn't cover it. I think that it's in different places. I think that my impression of Hemingway, my impression of Hemingway when we were doing this work was that he was aware that people wanted some of the things he had, and there were other attempts at his life before, and he would squirrel things away.
Yes.
He would squirrel things away in different locations. So
wow. Absolutely. We have to know how ingenious and resourceful the man is. As a journalist in France, he pretended to be a leader of the Allies, and he rolled into a Nazi town and took it over. This is the type of man that we're talking about. This is not a guy on the sidelines. Miss Olivia.
So was he part of the FBI or CIA, do you think? Because his son supposedly was, his son Jack.
Hemingway, no. If anything, he was hounded by the FBI and the CIA, and he did not want to take on those roles. Now, of course, he had a deep history with the military, and I'm sure they wanted him for intelligence reasons to give them briefings, as they would any American over there during World War II. But apparently, nothing more beyond that, because he was despised by CIA circles. And at the end of his life, he said that the FBI and the CIA were working together through his bank records, through his personal history, to destroy him. That was his impression. That was his impression of the situation, unless Hemingway felt that the CIA had created this gun accident suicide. So that's where the family stood on the matter. The girls growing up, interestingly enough, were basically kept in the background on this story, and it kind of formed a huge disconnect in their lives as it goes. And I think that's something that Mariel talks about quite a bit. Okay, keep going.
Okay, so Trudy Nichols says, so has Cuba been a longtime target of the deep state because of its proximity to Atlantis? And Space Ghost says Cuba must have been a Stargate.
Gigi.
Yeah, well, obviously Cuba was a huge target because it's it's between Bimini and the Yucatan, and then there's that city there, and Lord knows what else is there that we just don't have access to. So it absolutely, I believe, was a serious target. The Bay of Pigs shows us that as well. And a Stargate, absolutely, it is. And I think around going into Mexico and that area also, I mean, there's a lot of that stuff hanging around there, a lot of that dimensional slipping going on.
Great point. Absolutely. I think it's interesting when we get to Stargates because so much unusual activity takes place there in the Bermuda Triangle around Bimini and all the rest of it. And that's the kind of thing that you would attribute to, I know they talk about ancient Stargates and things in like Egypt, for example, but there's something about the water itself, right? I mean, this makes it particularly potent as a spot. And Gigi, you and I went through this very unusual conversation where a caller called into a radio program after he had a psychic on talking about this very issue of the Bimini Wall. The story is from 1976, and you and I listened to this recording on it, and we're going to do more work on that. But basically, this very unusual voice comes on and says, this is it's protected by a certain council, and it's a very important astronomical spot. And the voice had a quality to it that you kind of tuned into a little bit, which is a kind of a disembodied electronic voice.
Yeah, I actually heard it because it said it to me. Well, it was, I was listening and I was like, geez, what is that? And it sounded like it came in and it sounded like a transcontinental accent.
Yes.
And then so kind of gets like your attention, like, oh, like, what's that? Who's talking to me? And then it was like it was as though it was like a robot voice that was garbled, like it was underwater, and it was like, whoa, and it was talking, and it was around that area.
That is so fascinating. Of course, that got us on this trail of this 1976 radio show where this person called in with the same exact sound. What's weird is that John Keel, who had done so much research on the Men in Black, would get these calls from them when he was close to a case, trying to mislead him or redirect him or whatever. And he said, it sounded to me like they were calling from another dimension and somehow using electricity to make a voice box.
That's what it was. That makes so much, now that even you're saying it now, makes so much sense as to why it would start out as that like transcontinental radio and then shift into something else. And then when I looked at it, it was like, because I was like, I want to see this. It was like a black kind of blob. And then I pushed further and it was just numbers behind it.
Wow.
So I don't know, like that's some kind of next level. I don't know what.
Yeah.
But
that's deep. You're going deep astral on that. That's
that's what I do.
Yes. Fascinating, Gigi. Miss Olivia, keep rolling.
Well, this is really interesting. Ray Daw says, 40 years ago, I lived in Key West, and some of the old conchs, I guess is what they were called, talked about Hemingway having seance rituals. Rumors? I don't know. It's fascinating. And Jim Roy, the heretic, says, isn't the fifth dimension the ability to see all time, past, present, and future all at once?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Okay. So do you think that when he asked that question, I thought immediately about Cayce and how Hemingway must have wanted to understand how Cayce tapped into that
timeless state?
Yes.
The Akashic record.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, it's weird. I'll tell you something interesting since you mentioned the Akashic record, that during that Bimini, there's a lot of weird things about the Bimini readings, and I'm going to go deeper into them tomorrow because I have them all here. I've got them all printed out, the actual readings and the notes around them, the text of the readings, directly from the foundation. One of the weird things about these readings relating to Bimini is the people are talking about this well, the healing well, and we know that Lester will spend all this basically blood and treasure to find it, and he does. But they're all in here talking about this healing Atlantean well that is on Bimini, which I found interesting because now we see these things threading together. But at the end of the reading, there's two odd things. One, there was a whole other reading on Bimini that disappeared. Now, I'll tell you what's strange about that is Cayce readings don't disappear. Gladys Davis had this incredible nerve net for bringing all that material in. For a Bimini reading to disappear is quite remarkable. And it was the follow-up one to the one that said it'll raise up in 68 or 69. Someone got their hands on that reading. That's not such a good feeling. But the other weird thing is that at the end of the reading, he starts talking about how the Akashic record could be played, that you could actually have a device that would play the Akashic record. There was a possibility of doing that. That's quite remarkable.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It's sort of spirit matter technology. And I think that, in my opinion, that kind of device would need to be obviously tapping into someone would need to be stabilizing that and triangulating it properly. So it would technically have to be there'd have to be a triangulation, but you could get it to go onto a device.
But you have to have somebody who's pretty high vibration operating the stuff, or else it would probably blow up in their face.
Yeah, you'd have to have somebody in this dimension, and then you'd have to triangulate it probably with a higher one, and then you could probably start doing something, playing with something like that.
Right. Absolutely. Miss Olivia.
Okay, so these are all about Autec.
Oh yeah,
yes.
Interesting.
Did you get a chance to study that for this, or are you going to go into that tomorrow?
Well, Autec doesn't directly relate. It's very interesting. Autec's an unusual facility. It's kind of like the Area 51 of the oceans, and it's restricted space right there in the Bahamas. And it is known for similar types of things that you see at Area 51, except when people look down, they see what's going on down there. So this is the nature of Autec. It was displayed. They did a great job on it in something called UFO Hunters, which was a TV show. And somebody warned them not to do. I don't know if this is just one of those kind of promo stories, but it is true that the show was cut off 2 episodes later. They didn't do any more shows. And Bill Burns, who was the big producer star of that, he said that he had been warned himself that they shouldn't go near Autec. Now, what's odd is that one of the best remote viewers shows up in that, Joseph McMonagle, and he describes something that looks like a gray operating a craft there around the waters in Autec. So yeah, Autec is an unusual facility. I'm not sure we can really go that deep into Autec unless they have something specific.
That sounds like a whole episode.
Yeah, it is.
And
but it's in the same location. They have that. That's a great point, everyone.
And it's a partnership between the Greys and the Deep State.
Well, we can assume that. It's certainly something unusual is going on over there, a la Area. I think the best way to describe it is Area 51 of the ocean. And people do get into trouble trying to get information about it, and they did rebuff the UFO Hunters and Bill Burns doing it. It's definitely worth following up on.
Right, and McMonagle said he knew a lot more, but he was not willing to share it.
Well, this is the thing. McMonagle's been in CIA programs for years and U.S. military programs, because there was a heavy-duty remote viewing program. And Russell Targ identified McMonagle as one of the better, one of the greats, really, remote viewing. So, Ingo Swann, Joseph McMonagle, these were the real legends that came out of that program. The CIA wanted to use them, presumably, for national security situations. So there's no question he said, well, I see this. I'm working on a particular program. I can't tell you about that. There are things going on here, but I can't mention them because he's under secrecy seals. But he could tell them about this little gray moving around in a craft down there somehow. That wasn't off limits to him. I don't know how that works.
If anybody has any information, any intel in the audience, and they want to contact you?
info@darkjournalist.com. I'm here. And there are ways, if you tell me in the email that there's information you want to get to me that needs to be more secure than an email, we can arrange that.
All right, this is a great question. Brandon Jimenez, DJ, what should we take from Atlantis being all over the media this week?
Oh, isn't that interesting? Well, there's a couple of things. Basically, I think it's in the air. It's in the atmosphere, for sure. I've gone through, one of the things that Gigi and I were talking about before the show is that NASA had a program called Project Atlantis, and it was about studying marine geology. Somehow, Gigi, I don't think that's what they were up to.
No, they weren't studying marine geo. They're like, yeah, we're just studying it right over this city in Cuba. I want to know how the current flows here.
We've set up our launch pad on the Bimini Wall. Is that okay? I do want to ask you something, Gigi, because you have a great sense for the off-world connection to these things and for those older cultures and their connections to the off-world civilizations. What is the role, we were talking about how it's actually true that Atlantis is a bigger revelation for humanity. It's a bigger disclosure than the UFO reality in a sense because it relates directly to us. You said something about that I really gravitated to. Can you just kind of tell me what you mean?
Just about UFOs can sometimes be a distraction, or that is that what you're meaning?
Yeah, it's kind of like the Atlantis part. It's almost more suppressed because it relates directly to our own experience as opposed to an off-world civilization and our connection with them. It's about us.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead. Actually, you're the one who gave me that line.
No, it's you're right. It's exactly true. It's something that we can actually access within our bodies and within who we are that can change us. And sometimes when it's just, oh, it's an ET or, oh, it's off world. And it's not that these things don't happen. Lord knows my YouTube channel talks about it all the time. It does. But we have to be able to parse out what is a lost civilization that had a high society and when someone's coming in as well. And we also have to be able to parse out what is inner earth stuff too, because that's different as well. So there's a lot of things going on that is under I think the umbrella of ancient aliens, but it's getting lost. There's a lot of confusion that disconnects us from who we are.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And a lot of that, if you dismiss the Atlantis question and run after this ancient aliens, aliens built the pyramids, aliens did this. By the way, Gigi, aliens engineered us because Zecharia Sitchin said they made us Anunnaki slaves. I mean,
and of course, when they engineer you, it's not like, oh, the earth has a consciousness and the human beings on earth work in harmony with everything and we're all evolving. It's not like something organic. It's like, yeah, you were taken and you were created as slaves. So
right.
they're giving you this mentality that you're not good enough and that you're nothing but a slave and your very DNA is nothing but lesser than anyone. And so you have to really watch that kind of stuff. Don't get caught up in the euphoria of there being life out there. Listen to what the undertone is of what's being said, even in some of the more common things. Like with the Disclosure film that was out, it was all like very anti-reptilian, very anti-certain things. And it was like pieces of half-truth
right,
mixed in with truth. You have to be so careful with like the misinformation around ETs and around Atlantis, because there's a lot of people that would like to control that narrative by giving us half-truths that resonate somewhere very deep.
Yeah, fascinating. Absolutely. I 100% agree. I think the way it's presented is, we've been Sumerian to death, Anunnaki to death, and they really dismiss the Atlantis thing or try to roll it into some kind of ET sandwich. And that's completely, the UFO file stands in one place in relation to all this activity. It's crucial. But Atlantis, the high technology exhibited in Atlantis, the destruction, the Apotheum after effect, the mystery schools holding that knowledge for thousands of years of our history, the fact that the mystery schools, Steiner's work, Cayce's, Blavatsky's, they tell us that our spiritual roots are in this period of Atlantis. That's really where our focus should be in terms of finding out who we are. Rather than some overlords, ETs coming down and giving us that information and, or the really negative stories, like you were saying. And I think those are very prevalent too. And they seem planted.
They do feel that way. Well, it's like taking one species of ET and saying that's always, they're very negative. That's it. There's no dimension to it.
Yes.
And there's no, that's not real. That's not real life. These are stories that are woven in a certain way to get you to do that 2 minutes hate thing.
Yes.
Where, well, we can't get people, well, you know, they always want to get you to hate a different race or a different whatever. They're doing the same thing with ETs too. And at the same time, they're disconnecting you from remembering who you are. Humans are claircognizant beings. Fifth dimensional time or fifth dimensional space, like Hemingway was saying, is real. It's called remembering. And we have the ability to do that. And so that's what people don't want, is they don't want you to remember who you are and start getting little bits and pieces of feelings of being somewhere, being someone. And then you put them together, and then soon you're able to access that 5D level of no time. And that's when things in the material world change.
Wow.
So that's why it's so important.
Incredible.
Right. And Gigi, when you're talking about remembering, this is not how we usually use the term remembering. This is a much more shamanic version of remembering.
Remembering, taking aspects, members of your lives back into you, and being able to pull and access them as you need them. That is being a fully awakened. And it is, you're right, Olivia, it's very shamanic. It's the very deep spirituality that is beyond any religion that we all know how to do, but we limit ourselves from. And so we have to remember and know that we can do that. And
is this included in your psychic training?
It is. I do cover, well, the remembering is particularly claircognizant, so that's getting downloads of information. So a lot of Akashic stuff tends to be that way, and then the other clairs will pop on. But I do cover that in the one that I have now, and I can go more into that in videos, and if people are interested, just let me know, and I can add more of that too. But I have to be honest, it is natural. So the moment that you start to meditate and develop yourself, you will just start to remember. It is a very natural thing that we will do.
Wow, amazing. What we're going to do, we're going to take the last question for tonight. We're going to roll some of the questions from tonight into tomorrow. We're coming back at 6 o'clock tomorrow night with Gigi Young. And I want to remind everyone that you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're exploring the documents, the Cayce readings, Hemingway's experience in Cuba, the civilization, the city that Paul Zalitsky found off Cuba. These are all facts. There's no speculation in any of those details. We can speculate as to purposes of why Kennedy was helping Hemingway get that capsule out, etc. But there's no question, even the media will tell you that he tried to get that capsule out. So it's on the record, but stringing it together with the correct dots, connecting those dots properly, incorporating the deep state knowledge and the mystery school knowledge and the UFO file, this is how we get to a different place, a different paradigm in this work, and that's where we're rolling towards. We're going to take the last question tonight. Tomorrow night we're back at 6 o'clock. I want to mention this, which is when we got into those celebrities that got into buying lots in the Atlantic Ocean waiting for Atlantis to rise. This is going to be a very fascinating person to look at in this regard, and it's John Lennon, whose obsession with Atlantis was well known to people in his tight circle, and his own incredible kind of psychic experiences that I think was channeled very often through his music. He's going to be a very important piece of tomorrow night's program. So you're going to want to be here at 6 o'clock tomorrow night, and we'll be back with Gigi Young. Now we're going to take the last question for tonight, and Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay, David McCain. Gigi, if the soul is constantly evolving through many incarnations, do you believe the past souls of Atlantis are with us today, evolving and guiding mankind? And I would add to that, and to what end? What is our future?
Great question. Yes. The short answer is yes. The short answer is that many people now are incarnated again from that time period because it's so pivotal. So we're here in physical form, and of course there are beings guiding us as well. Yes, yes, yes.
I like that. I like ending the show on yes, yes, yes. Nice and
Yes,
young.
yes. The Trinity.
Let's take a quick picture shot here. That's Rudolf Steiner of Anthroposophy and Annie Besant of Theosophy. These are the individuals who gave us the opportunity here by working on developing the mystery school material for public dissemination. We'll keep them in mind as we go along in this series, and we will be back tomorrow night at 6 p.m. In the meantime, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, make sure that you're on that mailing list. You're going to need it. Subscribe to the site. We're going to do X dialogues coming up. You can only get those in the subscriber section. The X dialogues are going to be with experts exploring the X Steganography in the series that we're doing. So make sure that you get behind the things that you are getting benefit from. And it's a better reality. It's something we do here. And, you know, in relation to WikiLeaks, for example, make sure we get behind the people who are giving us the real information and the real transparency behind the incredible things that are going on. And that includes Gigi Young, who has given us incredible overview tonight. And Gigi Young is at gigiyoung.com, and her incredible intuitive training series is something that people are just raving about because there's nothing really quite like it out there. I think this is unique.
It is. I think, you know, psychic ability has changed ever since 2012. The energy's changed. How we function is a little bit different. So some of the older material isn't as poignant sometimes as
Right.
a new perspective.
Something new is coming in there. And I like also that there's a beginner's tool in there with it. They get that original exposure. And I highly recommend people go to your YouTube channel where you do these incredible videos that I found incredibly informative over time and very eclectic, that you can go into things relating to Lemuria or star seeds. You know, just this wave of material in there, fascinating YouTube channel and information there as well. We will be back tomorrow night. Miss Olivia, you get the last word.
Well, you had a picture of John Lennon that you never really got to.
I
And
did.
everybody,
I showed
you get to it?
Oh no, I did. Yeah.
But you didn't get to the stories attached to John Lennon, did you?
No, well, that's for tomorrow night.
Okay.
Oh,
right.
yes. I know we have a lot about John Lennon, but I did.
Okay. Sorry.
Gigi, did I not hold up John Lennon's
You
picture?
did.
All right. Sorry. Patrol. I didn't count.
I'm not in trouble anymore.
You got to control the trolls.
Troll Patrol. It's kind of like Rat Patrol. It's
It is.
tricky. But Gigi, thank you so much. An incredible insight. We really appreciate it. It's great having you.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Okay. And we will see everyone tomorrow night. I'm going to do a shout out here to a couple of people. Sam Raven out there. I have not seen Sam Raven out there recently. So awesome to see you. Sir, Shadow Boxer, Occult Fan, and PJ Liberty Bell. Terrific people out there tonight. We will see you. Dr. J Radio Live. Yes. I think I saw your message up there, Dr. J. Excellent work that you guys do. And we'll definitely be in touch. And also, I like this name, Bored and Opinionated.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
Terrific name. Once in a while. There was a guy on the other night. It was Carl Jung. I thought that was pretty original. We will be back next week also, but I always say that. But tomorrow night is when we're going to be back. That's 6 o'clock, and we're looking forward to having everyone there. Sign up for the newsletter. Go to darkjournalist.com and get in that loop with us. We will see you tomorrow night. Olivia, what's going to happen for dinner? What are you in the mood for?
It's all pizza all the time.
What do you think, Gigi? Pizza?
With extra cheese.
Gigi blinked out when you said pizza. That's the magic word. We will see everyone tomorrow night.
Okay. See you tomorrow.
Pizzetta. That's got to be the word. That's the word of the night. Thank you, everyone. Terrific show. Really fantastic questions. Much obliged.